How do we start understanding what the network state is?
Sure. If Bitcoin is a decentralized currency, a network state's a decentralized country. Satoshi has basically developed this technology that has just enormous impact on the whole world, but one of the biggest things is it creates voluntarism. And what that means is I think we're going to have 1,000 voluntary societies that you can join. And so this is kind of the peanut butter to the jelly of Bitcoin. So imagine if you had a social network, but the members of that social network crowdfunded territory around the world and wanted to live together. So you have little pockets in all these different places, and there's various kinds of diaspora communities. What if they could be networked together? Because that's one of the things the internet lets you do, is it lets you network these archipelagos. Many people will say something like, Balaji, no one's ever going to go and live in your crazy startup. Maybe 1% of the world will do that. If 1% of the world does that, that's completely world changing, because 4% build the United States. If 1% of the world goes and forms network states, that's 70 million people. It will be a cross-section of very smart, influential, early adopters, pioneer type people. It will be the new world. It's America after America. 1 million Bitcoiners could afford a Bitcoin country.
Balaji, thank you very much for coming and doing this with us. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Glad to be here.
Now, you've got the network state book that's out, and I've seen that you've been doing a few interviews and quite a few Twitter posts about that.
Yes.
How do we start understanding what the network state is?
Sure. If Bitcoin is a decentralized currency, a network state's a decentralized country. And so this is Satoshi has basically developed this technology, as we know, that has just enormous impact on the whole world. But one of the biggest things is it creates voluntarism, right? It's a voluntary society. And what that means is I think we're going to have 1,000 voluntary societies that you can join. And so this is kind of the peanut butter to the jelly of Bitcoin in the sense of if anybody can exit, well, what did they enter? And so, for example, you can have a vegan village, you can have a carnivory community, you could have Latin immersion, Sanskrit immersion, bringing back old languages, or, Cantonese immersion, Basque immersion, for example, right? You could have communities that are focused on something someone might consider idiosyncratic, like morning people, and everything is just calibrated so every shop is open in the morning and the internet goes off at night. That's actually something that some universities did in China, where people were playing video games too late, and so they shut off the internet at night just to get people to go to sleep on time or whatever. Just things like that, where you can set up the defaults of a society, just like the 140 character default to Twitter initially made it a thing, or Snapchat had disappearing messages, and that actually those constraints gave character, right? You can imagine many different ways on which you can innovate in the modern world from a societal standpoint, whether it's diet, whether it's daily practices, or what have you. And we won't know which of those are attractive to people unless you run the experiment, right? And so, can I project, by the way? Can I put something on screen?
Sure, I'll ask my producer. Can you give him control of the screen? Yeah. You should be able to do it, he's saying.
Okay.
You can see it.
So that is thenetworkstate.com, right? And if you want to understand what a network state is, this is the network state in one image, okay? And I can show it to you as a still. So let me do that. So this is what a million-person network state looks like, right? It's like a physical social network. So imagine if you had a social network, but the members of that social network crowdfunded territory around the world and wanted to live together, okay? So it's a social network which is actually a community, not just a bunch of people who are yelling at each other online, right? They actually want to live together. And so it has nodes around the world, just like imagine if all the Chinatowns around the world or all the little Indias were networked together, right? So you have little pockets in all these different places. There's a Russian community, for example, in Brighton Beach in New York, and there's various kinds of diaspora communities. What if they could be networked together? Because that's one of the things the internet lets you do, is it lets you network these archipelagos. Similar to, have you ever seen the country of Indonesia on a map?
Sure.
Yeah. So that's a bunch of islands separated by ocean, but they conceptualize themselves as one country. Even if they've got kind of weird borders in some ways, right? They conceptualize themselves as one country. So similarly, if you had a bunch of islands separated by the internet, you could still conceptualize yourself as one political entity. There's many precedents for this. There's like Google offices around the world. Hilton has actually hundreds of hotels and like 1 million beds worldwide. Obviously, Starbucks, all these multinationals have these things around the world. What nobody has done, though, even though it's totally feasible to do, is you take the offices of Google and the beds of Hilton and the stores of Starbucks, and you vertically integrate them, and then you have them everywhere in the world. And now you've got something that's what like a network state feels like. It's like a bunch of communities or a bunch of individual physical nodes that are networked together into a single online community, right? And so physically it's spread out, but digitally it's in one place. They're in the same Discord, they've got the same cryptocurrency, and so on and so forth. And here's a visual of how you'd actually build a network state. This is the network state in one GIF, right? Where essentially you go from 1,700, 17,000, 172. So notice it starts with just one guy like Zuck or somebody in their dorm, and they're starting this thing, or Satoshi. They start this thing and it just grows and grows and grows like this, right? So you can do it from zero resources. You just have to be organized enough to organize people to crowdfund territory. And it can go from simply LARPing in your apartment to, taking over a floor of a building, taking over an entire building, and so on and so forth, if that makes any sense, right? So, because in a sense, Estonia, the country Estonia?
Sure.
It's got about 1 million Estonians. In a real sense, those 1 million Estonians can afford Estonia. Let's say they
can't.
They can afford, right? Yeah. Meaning, if you took the map of Estonia and you carved up every parcel of land there, right? That's like a big chunk of territory. It's not a huge country, but it's like substantial. And the 1 million people who are Estonians own most of that territory. So in a deep sense, the 1 million Estonians could afford Estonia. So 1 million Bitcoiners could afford a Bitcoin country.
Need cash without selling your Bitcoin? With DeBiFi, you borrow against your Bitcoin, non-custodial, multi-sig escrow, and you keep your keys. No banks, no selling, just institutional grade liquidity with terms up to 2 years and APRs as low as 9%. All transactions are signed using private keys on your own device. Using a 3 of 4 multi-sig setup, 3 out of 4 keys must approve every transaction, giving you control, transparency, and peace of mind. Whether you're a hodler, miner, small business, or treasury team, DeBiFi gives you the cash you need now without giving up your Bitcoin upside or triggering a taxable event. Get liquidity, keep exposure, and stay secure. That's DeBiFi. DeBiFi, your Bitcoin, your money. Looking for a secure, trusted way to buy, sell, and hold Bitcoin? GEMINI has been leading the way since 2014. Founded by the Winklevoss twins to be a security-first, fully regulated Bitcoin platform. With GEMINI, your Bitcoin is protected with enterprise-grade security, backed by insurance and Type 2 certifications for SOC 1 and SOC 2. Whether you're new to Bitcoin or a long-time hodler, GEMINI gives you the tools to stack sats and build generational wealth your way. From simple one-tap buys to advanced charts and trading features, it's all here. Buy, sell, and hold securely. That's GEMINI. GEMINI. Bitcoin with confidence. Sure.
It's a different path. Like El Salvador is sort of land first, and then it went up to the cloud. But you could also build a cloud community that could then crowdfund land. And the concept of the network state is not necessarily all in one place, right? You spread out around the world, and then there'll probably be nodes like capital cities, just like, think about how far away New York and Hawaii and Anchorage are, right? Or how far away Moscow and Vladivostok are. You can be pretty far and still be in the same country if you've got the right links, communication, transportation, other links, right? And you don't necessarily have to be, by the way, I think there is a goal of eventually becoming a UN member, right? That's like diplomatic recognition. That's similar to Bitcoin becoming the reserve asset of the United States, which just happened, right? Or the El Salvador thing. But even way before then, just getting a special economic zone gets you very far, right? And to be clear, you can do this completely without any new coins or anything like that. You can just use Bitcoin if you want to be Bitcoin only. And you just crowdfund the territory, and you just run it like basically a giant Hilton or a real estate kind of thing, right? And this, by the way, I think is a positive version of the Bitcoin Citadel. You know why? Like citadels, you know the reference from Reddit?
Yeah.
Yeah, like that old post that basically people took seriously. The problem with the citadel concept is like this fortified outpost in Mad Max, and it sounds cool online, but in practice, you don't have necessarily like clean water. Like civilization is hard. There's many subroutines that go into civilization, and if you can't rebuild like an operating system from scratch, rebuilding all of civilization from scratch, from running water, like plumbing, all that's hard, very hard, right? But if you have something like a network society, then a network state, you can network a community around the world, and you don't have to be like just holed up in one citadel, guns out like Mad Max or what have you, right? You're growing, you're expanding. It's a positive sum vision in that sense, So that's the network state. And then now the thing about this is I wrote version 1 of the book, and I was going to write version 2, but you know what stopped me? It's basically, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they are not, right? So if I just did another theoretical kind of thing, people be like, okay, but why did you do it? Why didn't you show us?
We're stuck on the first idea, Balaji. Are you giving us another idea?
Yeah, exactly, right? So it's like, okay, what I really need to do is actually make it happen myself, and then by paving a way, I can pave a path for many other people, right? And that's what we've done. So if I show you this, so Network School is Startup Society, right? And this is a video. You can play this video. So this shows the opening day and people checking in, right? And essentially, people saying hi using augmented reality, VR. There's a Network School flag, right? There's yes, I know it's Vitalik, okay, and it's a Bitcoin podcast, but Bitcoiners welcome, of course. We got the Bitcoin flag up there. You see that, right? We've got content production. We've got talks, robot dogs. It's pretty cool. I think this is pretty cool, right? And it's as if these are all speakers and tech entrepreneurs. These are drones, right? We've got this really tricked out gym where you could just like every machine is there. People work out every day, right? So we've got a lot of jacked people. And that's Brian Johnson, by the way. That's our yoga studio. We're there for kids. We've got like this beautiful outdoors, right? So we basically took over this island, and here's some outdoor talks, right? People play chess. They just do all kinds of fun stuff. It's just kind of cool, right? And we offer food. Everything is included in the membership, right? So it's society as a service, right? So you just do that, and then you basically don't have to think about anything else, and you can just work and hang out and so on. Everything is taken care of, and there's parties on the beach and so on, right? That's like a pretty cool drone shot, I think, right?
So that shot we've just seen where it zooms out, it's got a couple of buildings on the beachside front. Is that the network state site for your? Yeah.
So that is the network school. So the network state, think of network state as an abstract concept like cryptocurrency or blockchain,
cool.
And then network school is a startup society, right? And I kind of reserve the term network state for a diplomatically recognized society, right? So I'd call ourselves a startup society until we actually achieve diplomatic recognition, okay? Which we might not do, by the way, here. We might have to, like, this is just our first location. We'll expand around the world and so on. This is a multi-year kind of thing. It took, many years to build WhatsApp, Meta, Google, et cetera, Bitcoin, these things to their current size of millions or billions of people. But that journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and this is our first node. So that's what we're doing.
So in principle, people can sort of converge and coalesce around any kind of interest to create these nodes. But which interests do you think will most likely lead to the initial adoption of network state nodes, for example?
Well, that's a great question. So there's actually we're going to be bringing this into our dashboard. But here's a list. So this is really a movement that's happening. I do think that network states are crypto communities, and that's what comes after cryptocurrency, or this is what's enabled by it. In the same way that social media and GPUs enabled AI, right? Remote work and cryptocurrencies enable crypto communities, right? And so this is a open source dashboard for aspiring network states. And look, there's a lot of them. That's pretty cool, right? Now, a lot of these are at different stages of development. Some of them are physical, some of them are digital that want to become physical, and so on and so forth, right? But these are all people who think of themselves as having the aspiration of eventually becoming a network state.
So what's the roadmap from virtual to real life manifestation of one of these nodes to becoming a community?
Good question. So I've got a one-liner, which is the network state is about real estate as much as cryptocurrency is about fiat currency. Okay, and what I mean by that is, so as you may know, I was CTO of Coinbase, and I also actually launched USDC, which I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Sure.
So a surprising thing about cryptocurrency was Bitcoin was developed to break free of the banks, if you recall, obviously, right, in the early 2000s or 2010s. And so at first, the concept of cryptocurrency exchange seemed like completely against Satoshi's principles. Wait a second. We're supposed to be against the banks. And what do we mean BTC for USD? Like we should build our own digital economy and it turned out that interface between BTC and USD was actually one of the most important things in the whole space, maybe the most important, because it's like the bridge from the old world to the new world, right? Or if you want, if America is the new world, then Bitcoin and the internet are the new world, right? And so that bridge is really, really important. And that fiat to crypto bridge meant that we had to spend so much more effort on like fiat than I thought we did, right? We had to understand the fiat banking rails. We had to understand their crazy APIs. We had to figure out all these banking relationships and all this stuff, right? Like Coinbase was a very complicated business, is a complicated business, because it has to deal with a lot of different kinds of complexity and make that easy to the user. Just buy Bitcoin for USD. That's what they just want to do. But just making something simple is really hard. Simple is hard, hard is impossible. So in the same way, just like cryptocurrency was about fiat currency, the network state's about real estate. You may want this fully digital thing, but it's the collision with the physical world that is actually a collision that sounds, let's say the interface with the physical world, that is often the hard part, right? Not the only hard part. You're still cloud first, land last, but not land never. However, that's just a new set of skills, a new set of muscles, if you will, right? That's a video of this new network school fellowship where anyone from anywhere we can fund them, right? As the US is cutting off immigration and so on. I understand why they're doing it, but I also think there's a ton of global tech talent, which frankly doesn't need to be in America. It can be anywhere, right? But where's anywhere? Now we've got somewhere, right? We've got a global coordinating point. So you can bring this tech talent. And the thing is, there's a bunch of baseline things that you would expect. You'd expect laundry, Wi-Fi, food, office, all this kind of stuff, right? And each one of those is like booting up a service. It's like, when you have a website, you've got a content delivery network, you've got a load balancer, you have a database, you have all this kind of stuff, right? In the same way, booting up something in the physical world to do society as a service, again, it's not like running laundry for yourself. It's like running laundry for like 256 people or something like that. It's like a different kind of thing, right? And then you have to do that across cafe, gym. It's not like impossible, but it's just a lot of services to boot up. So that's the single biggest thing that we've gotten, I think, decently good at. Video looks pretty good. People are happy here, I think. And that was the biggest new skill. That was similar to cryptocurrencies about fiat currency.
So when I think about some obvious interests around which a network state could sort of apply, we see the sort of startup communities all around the world. You could consider them an informal sort of network state as such. And then when I see people leaving one place and going to another, like Dubai or Singapore or whatever, there's usually a reason, whether it's tax or whether it's more business and trade opportunities. We can see those sorts of things happen already. I guess my question is like, what is the necessity for that to then translate into a network state above and beyond what it already is now?
Yeah, totally. So you're absolutely right. There's tons of digital nomad visas. People could go to Singapore. They can go to Dubai. Those are great places. And
they're all bound by a sort of cultural affinity. For example, in the startup world, the startup scene in Portugal might be different from San Francisco in some ways, but they have a very strong cultural affinity as well, despite people being from all sorts of different places. etc.
Yes.
So, but what's going to? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And in fact, actually, the way I put it is this: tech has emerged as a class. Okay, and what I mean by that is it wasn't really a thing. I mean, it was very intuitive, like the PC homebrew, PC Computer Club in the 70s and 80s. Then the 90s with Netscape, the first internet startup, you had something that was kind of recognizable. And then in the 2000s, you started to have PayPal Mafia, and Thiel, Elon, Paul Graham, and Y Combinator, Andreessen Horowitz towards the end of the 2000s, Neville Ravikant, AngelList. And you started to have like a story of tech, right? This was Paul Graham's writings and A and Z blog posts and, make something people want. Like Y Combinator, I'd argue maybe the single most important in terms of the story of tech. Thiel, also very important at the time. A and Z, I think, pretty important. And then in the 2010s, you started to have the story become even more coherent in terms of cryptocurrency. See, the thing is, everybody in cryptocurrency, whether they're Bitcoin only or they're, working in exchange like Coinbase, Binance, or even on another coin, they all know the story of Bitcoin. And we really take that for granted, but that's a really big deal because they all know Satoshi and they all know Bitcoin. They all value, in some sense, decentralization, or at least they know that other people value it. They value, at least in some sense, deflation rather than inflation. They value open source, peer-to-peer. There's a lot of values that are baked into Bitcoin because that's in some ways, even more than the technical accomplishment of Bitcoin was the why of why people would want this. It was really not obvious for many people at the beginning. I want a decentralized digital currency. What did that even mean if you warp your way back to 2009, 2010? And digital gold starts to explain it and so on. But a lot of people did not get the utility for a long time. Like, why would you want this, right? So the why, the values underpin the valuation, right? And that story, the story of Satoshi, is something which we really take for granted because, for example, if somebody, leaves Coinbase and they go and work at Farcaster, or they leave Coinbase and they work at BlackRock doing Bitcoin, or they're Binance and they go and work at Kraken. There's a common story. You can boot up much faster because the personalities in the industry, the coins, lots of the historical drama, like, the DAO hack of Ethereum and so on. There's a whole history we have as a community that's really, and to distinguish that, for example, let's take the Y Combinator startups for as a distinction, right? Airbnb, Dropbox, Stripe, and so on and so forth. They're great companies, but their employees don't really, what is the history of Airbnb? Could you rattle it off? Probably not, right? Could you rattle off the history of Dropbox? Maybe not, right? Whereas crypto, there's a bunch of events that we're all kind of aware of and we have a common story, right? That's nothing against Dropbox or Airbnb, but they're basically very good companies that make great products and their CEOs know each other as all alumni of Y Combinator, but they're kind of in their own lane, right? To be clear, even this, they still think of them as being in tech. So they're often at the same open source conferences and so on. Even them, they're more coherent as a community than one layer before, which is the 90s, where people were very, very siloed. Right? They didn't know each other at all, right? So if you take that from extremely siloed 90s to the tech community of the 2000s to cryptocurrency of the 2010s, I think the next step is physical startup societies, right? Where what you're correctly observing is that guy in Portugal knows a lot about American tech. They know the names, they know the companies, they have general, they're going to have their own view on, let's say drones or augmented reality or something like that, right? They'll have some, they'll know something about Portugal specific stuff, but they will have a good chunk of like the global conversation that's happening on X, and they know a lot of the personalities, right? That's actually necessary to have a society. Like, as a small example, if you have people who speak Turkish and Chinese, right? Hard for them to form a society because they can't even communicate, right? That's obvious because that's the level of language, undeniable. But if they speak the same language, but they have completely, like another example, North Korea and South Korea, they both speak Korean, but they have just genuinely different world models of like who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, what is, like things that are completely illegal in South Korea are completely illegal in North Korea, like starting a business is like death penalty or what have you. I don't know how harsh North Korea is today, but for many years it was the hermit kingdom. Maybe I don't think it's liberalized, right? But in many communist societies, you're literally executed for starting a business, right? So even if they're speaking the same language, they're at least as different as Catholic and Protestant, and really more so. Communist and Catholics are really totalizing, right? So having the same stories was a necessary but not sufficient condition for building startup societies. And that's what we're doing next. So let me pause there. And actually, let me come back to one of your points. You said, how does this differ from just going to Dubai or going to Singapore? Those are great places, right? And I like those places. In fact, we're based out of Singapore, or right next to Singapore in the Singapore Johor Special Economic Zone. So basically like right next door in this island, actually technically in Malaysia. And it's like 30 miles away from Singapore, but it's very, very, very close, 30 minutes away. So some people live in Singapore and they commute. Some people live here, full time. I'm here a lot. But with absolutely nothing against those countries, and those are great countries, those countries are fully formed, right? Singapore and the UAE are fully formed. And they've got LKY, Lee Kuan Yew, and they've got MBZ, and they've got their stories of hypergrowth. And that's amazing. And I'm glad they exist. But it's a little bit like, Apple exists and iOS exists, and then you built Uber on top, right? And Apple couldn't have done Uber, in my view. It's just too different a kind of thing, right? Or, Google Chrome exists and you built Figma on top. And like in theory, Google could have done Figma. It's just an app that runs on Google Chrome. But in practice, there's so much stuff that it's just a whole thing that's different from Google Drawings. You can go very deep on something, right? So in the same way, these existing countries are amazing. I have nothing against them. But we can build startup societies on top of them that just do completely new things. And the physicality of even having 1,000 people in one place that really believe something different than the rest of the world, you get public goods. You get a network effect when that happens. Let me pause there.
Do you envisage a network state superseding nation states, or a complement or a different layer to what nation states already represent?
A complement and a different layer. And the reason I say that is, if you think about America never went mainstream. You know why? Only 4% of the world is American, right?
Right. But culturally, we have such an affinity with American culture, despite whatever misgivings we might have about its the political empire and whatnot. I think most of the world has a very strong affinity with American culture.
I know. So it's a tongue-in-cheek point.
Sure.
But, the reason I'm making the point is many people will say something like, Balaji, no one's ever going to go and live in your crazy startup. Maybe 1% of the world will do that, right? If 1% of the world does that, that's completely world-changing because 4% build the United States. If 1% of the world goes and forms network states, that's 70 million people. It will be a cross-section of very smart, influential, early adopters, pioneer-type people. It will be the new world. Right? So that's how I think about it. It's America after America. America itself is becoming just another country, right? Like that's the entire thrust of everything that's happening now. It's like, get out, you're not a native, like the whole thing of like this new world that was something that was open and an open canvas for people to travel to and build things in, that's over, right? And we'll see what comes afterwards. I think there'll be a lot of shouting, a lot of shooting. But it's a whole separate topic we can
That's
get into.
very poetic. Maybe we'll get into it a little later on. But
yeah. But that's the First Amendment, Second Amendment to the extreme. A lot of shouting, a lot of shooting, right? But we need that frontier, right? And so far, that frontier has been the digital frontier. In a sense, imagine if you went, you kept going west for the frontier, right? And then in 1890, actually, the frontier closed. And then in 1991, it reopened and it was called the internet. And if you keep going west, there's actually two choices for what the frontier is. It's the cloud, or you get all the way to the Far East, which is China. Which is an interesting way of thinking about it. Like you push that limit of like, okay, so it's the cloud and then the land all the way over here. And that's actually where technological innovation is going, right? What is America minus the internet? It's much, much, much less than what it is, right? Like anytime people want to muster a defense of, it's still strong and still powerful, it's always like magnificent tech companies and AI and so on and so forth, right? And America minus internet is, whereas, for example, let's say, what is France minus internet? Well, it's the baguettes and it's the, it's the Eiffel Tower and it's the Louvre. They've got a thing on lock, right? That's something where they don't need to innovate. I mean, they can innovate, of course, but we take this for granted. Like France is just a thing that exists in your head as just centuries of culture and whatnot, that they've got a business model. It's locked, so to speak, right? And that's a big tourism thing for them, right? America is becoming like that. It's becoming basically, what is it? It's baseball, it's hot dogs, but innovation is moving somewhere else. And we're right in the middle of that stage where people are still in denial about it, but you're cutting off, it's both a left and right thing. It's like if you're shooting CEOs and you're cutting off student and worker and tourist visas, and you're proposing unrealized capital gains tax, and you're also pushing these huge tariffs, right? And you're wokeifying academia, but you're also cutting budgets for genuine research, right? That's something which is a pincer attack of both left and right. That's just pushing out scientists, engineers, technologists, and saying, find a new spot, right? Now, fortunately, most unicorns are actually, I should say most, let's say of 420 unicorns, let me show you this map.
Unicorns being startups or tech companies with a capitalization of greater than 1 billion.
Correct. That's right. Yes. Thank you. So if you look at the global unicorn map, let me play. So there's 420 cities home to a tech unicorn as of 2024. So you do not need to be in San Francisco. 419 of them were done outside of San Francisco, right?
It's really, can I just stop you there? It's really interesting to hear you say you do not have to be in San Francisco, because up until even just before COVID, it would have been unthinkable to say that with any kind of credibility.
Yes.
Do you think COVID has accelerated that, or it just crystallized the realization that had been building up?
Well, it's one of those things where sometimes, you can connect the dots in reverse, right? So even in 2019, I had this post which said, here, I'll show you this. It's a funny one. Ready? So we're in an interesting transitional era where San Francisco, Delaware is obviously wrong, but incorporating on-chain and going full remote is not yet obviously right. This is July 11th, 2019, right?
So the Delaware component of that equation, can you just briefly explain why you include that?
So first of all, now today, I think
this is from 2019.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's a hell of a call in 2019. Okay.
That's right. So basically, this is something which I don't think Delaware was on people's radars at that time as a trouble spot, right?
So what was bothering you about Delaware back then?
Yeah. So just as context, by the way, Delaware is the place that most companies get incorporated in the U.S. because it had the most reliable corporate law over the years, right? And it became more and more rickety to the point that they had this crazy judge who's like revoking Elon's pay package or what have you. And that's not a small thing. That's a huge thing, because if they'll do that for Elon and tens of billions of dollars, well, that's why Dropbox and all these other companies have started moving out of Delaware because of this, right?
Yeah. So Elon's pay package was approved by the shareholders and the board, and the judge thought to intervene and strike it out as being...
Because like one guy who owned like 12 shares or something launched some lawsuit, just genuinely, truly nuisance lawsuit that just being thrown out at every level of court. It should never have gotten to the point it did. It was purely a political thing based on bureaucratic animus against Elon, right? But the reason I was seeing that even in 2019 with San Francisco, I could just see how it was expensive, it was crime-ridden, it was filthy, and yet the network effects were still keeping people there because there wasn't an alternative, right? And with Delaware, essentially I could see even back then that the main vulnerability of all these tech companies was their interface with the state. That's to say, like, you have all this digital stuff, and then when you go down at a certain level of the platform, it's like drilling into bedrock. It's pieces of paper that your incorporation is in Delaware, your PDFs, your charters, your bylaw. That's a dependence on the state. And the reason that's a problem, or that was a problem, is that if you get, quote, too wealthy or too rich or too successful, and the state is screwed up enough, and it has that leverage, it can just, basically put a finger over your incorporation documents and propose unrealized cap gains taxes, or all the stuff that the Bolsheviks and so on did. The state can, if it feels starved enough in revenue, get extraordinarily nasty. And the manifestation of that is people are saying, oh my God, you're becoming too successful, you're too rich, I hate you so much, let me kill you. And basically the state is the manifestation of that, right? Sometimes it's actually anarchic mobs, but sometimes that negativity, that animus is manifested in the state bashing your head to take your money legally, right? Go ahead.
You say anarchic moms?
Anarchic mobs.
Mobs.
Mobs. For
I
me,
just
yeah,
had a vision of a whole
anarchic
mob of
mums.
soccer mums.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
sorry.
no, it's fine. So, um, the point being that like the trend, like hyper Bitcoinization and what that represents, and like what a change it's going to be to the world. You know, it's funny. We're actually 7-8 orders of magnitude on that journey. You know, from 1 cent per Bitcoin to $100,000 per Bitcoin. But like the last two are going to be a really, really, really big deal.
And painful, I think.
Very painful.
Because it's just this is just Bitcoin emerging up until now. And then from this point onwards, it's going to be a reflection of the health of our societies, essentially, the fiscal health of our societies. And that means something much more profound than just this asset emerging.
That's exactly right. Like basically, at Bitcoin 100,000, everybody is celebrating. At Bitcoin 1 million, a lot of people are mad, crying, angry, and Bitcoiners should realize that. And they should, you know, the number one thing is not really allocation; it's location. You know, Dahlia's actually also talked about this. Basically, allocation, location, organization. This upcoming crisis, in my view, and we can talk about what catalyzes it. It will be a lot worse than 2008 because, the analogy to 2008 or even 2020 with COVID. COVID is closer, but it's like, you know, the World Trade Center. Actually, there was an attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, right? And then there was 9/11, which was also, in a sense, an attack on the World Trade Center. And so both those you could classify under the same words: terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, right? But this was a headline for like a few days or something like that, and basically forgotten because it didn't blow anything up. And this was a like world historical event whose echoes still, you know, continue to the present day in many ways. All kinds of bombs and stuff flying around the world, right? So the order of magnitude consequences were just many, many orders of magnitude greater, even if you group them categorically under terrorist attack on the world, right? And so the difference between like the 2008 financial crisis and what is coming is similar to that, right? This is like the dollar crisis. This is the American crisis. You know, does the U.S. make it past July 4th, 2026? We'll see, right? Like the things that are being put in motion, especially by the tariffs, but also before then, are things that. Should I talk about this for a second? By the way,
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So basically, as we speak, you know, the full impact, I think, of the tariffs is yet to really be. So Trump imposed all these tariffs on all these countries, 190 plus countries all at once, because they have a vision of like rebuilding manufacturing in America, right? It's a very romantic vision that is not about the details. And there's like 20 immediate objections you could have. The first is that China built its physical plant in 45 years, and 45% tariffs are not going to do that in one day. The second is, if you actually wanted to help American businesses, you would be sitting with them and you'd say, what do you need? And they'd say, hey, could you cut regulations? And then I can actually go and build this new plant. What you would not do is just radically increase their costs for raw materials and inputs with a surprise tax and say, serves you right for importing stuff from abroad. They're like, this is, you know, where am I going to get this mineral or this raw material from? It's not in America. You know, you got to buy American, like just like crazy, just genuinely Maoist level insanity if you're running a business on this, right? So it's as if, you know, Black Lives Matter was burning down black businesses to, quote, help black people. And this, you know, MAGA tariffs are like destroying American businesses ostensibly to help American people. It's literally that, right? So third is the shortages that are going to come as a consequence. You know, like back in 2008, I ran a clinical lab for many years. And in 2008, there were the Beijing Olympics, right? And at the time, you know, for many years, Beijing was actually had a lot of air pollution. Now they've cleaned it all up with electric cars and so on, and clear skies. But for many years, Beijing had terrible air pollution. And it's because there were factories nearby. And one of those factories was cranking out these pharmaceutical precursors, these chemical reagents that you need for running biomedical reactions, right? And like the Communist Party gave the order to those factories, just shut off, stop doing your thing because we want clear skies for when all the people come for the 2008 Olympics, right? And so they just gave the order to shut this whole thing down for a while. And so they got the clear skies, but the consequence when I was running this lab was the price of a certain reagent just spiked up hundreds of fold, and reactions that previously cost us like a cent or negligible suddenly cost us like $5, $10, $50 to run, which was like a total work stoppage in that particular area of analysis, right? Now, what that meant was just like delays in lab tests, delays in, research and so on and so forth. But that gave me a feel for what China was. And that was almost 20 years ago, right? Now, when you do that today, God only knows what's going to happen, right? China is just the world's factory. You just have to understand what China is. It's like,
so what is it? And what do you think the difference would be now?
Oh my God. Well, okay, let me just calibrate. Ready? I've got this talk here. I've got some slides. Let me show you something.
I think about last year when I saw a photo comparing the air pollution in Beijing from early to mid 2000s to now, I hadn't realized that there was such a transformation. And I'm not sure that most people are aware of that either.
Yes, it's a complete transformation. So, in fact, actually, why don't I walk through this talk? Because it's a fair number of slides, but I think it's got a worldview. Okay? Good? Should I do it? Okay.
Yeah, go on. Do it.
All right, so here's a talk, and this kind of encapsulates a bunch of things into one thing, and it's a thesis, right? So the network states of the internet, and by the way, that's the Bitcoin orange over there, okay? The internet is not a place, but there will be internet places, and let me explain. So I wrote this book, The Network State, right? And I've opened this network school, which is a startup society, and I want to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing and so on, and let me give the thesis. Basically, the American empire, it was real and it was spectacular. But it's ending now because China is strong and Zeihan is wrong. Do you know this guy, Peter Zeihan?
We do in Bitcoin circles. He's quite infamous for suggesting on Joe Rogan's show that Bitcoin has a negative value. So hello, Peter. You're still wrong.
So I've got nothing against him as a person. I'm actually glad he puts out these arguments or what have you, but I disagree with them.
I like strong opinions, yeah.
Yes, that's right. China is strong, Zeihan is wrong. Yet it won't solely be a Chinese century. It will also be an internet century. And the future is China versus internet. And by the way, those are like two poles. Let's say CCP and BTC at the extreme ends. But there's a lot of intermediates. It doesn't always have to be versus. It can be and, it can be or, it can, many other relationships. But think of those as two poles, China versus internet. Those are the two heirs where China inherits the empire, but the internet inherits American values. And from them, we can build the network states of the internet, which is like, I think, the version 3.0. So you started with, let's say, the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Then you have the United States of America. And now I think we have the network states of the internet. I think that's going to be the version 3.0. And, basically, what comes after the next US dollar? It's the next United States of America. And this is the rebuild. To be clear, I prefer the 1990s went on forever. That was a great time. I prefer that the USA of my youth stick around. It's a really great country, but it's not going to. It's kind of like when you say this, people get really mad sometimes because it's like an elderly relative passing, and you say he might not be long for this world. They say, well, you want Grandpa to die, and I'm like, no. I'm just saying we have to prepare for it. They're like, what? How are you being so morbid? Blah blah blah, right? And we just have to be real. So let me explain why. So first, let's talk about the American century that passed, and then the upcoming Chinese century, and then the internet century. So the American century. American empire was real and it was spectacular. From 1991 to the present day, the US was the most dominant empire of all time and actually relatively benevolent for its extreme level of dominance. The UN headquarters were in New York. It had the global reserve currency, the world's largest military, universities literally training foreign heads of state. I mean, US-based Delaware multinationals in every country around the world, US-based regulators harmonizing, that's a term, regulations all around the world. 750 military bases worldwide. You could go on and on and on. American culture, movies, Hollywood, right? So America was just completely unmatched in history, and this did not happen by accident. Nothing, you don't get to global number one in every category by accident, right? What happened was actually, this book documents it. In 1939, 1940, see, up to that point, America had been content to let the British Empire just do its thing, right? Because it was, managing the high seas. Empire is a, nasty business and so on, or a difficult business. And it was only after the fall of France and Britain being endangered that the Americans realized, wait a second, if we don't step up, maybe the Nazis or the Soviets will become the global empire, and that would be bad. So they actually did it in part, really in large part, as a defensive move, where they're like, look, the British Empire is on the ropes, and we don't want it to be a Nazi or Soviet future. So this was essentially when they decided to go all in on empire because they felt they had to, right? And so a bunch of decisions were made at that time, and lots of institutions were set up from that vector. And Wertheim documents all the memos and stuff where they're consciously thinking about, okay, we need to achieve world domination or the Nazis or Soviets will, which frankly is actually a pretty good motivation for trying to, I understand their worldview, okay? Now, the thing is that when praising this, and I think on balance, I think I'm happy that the Americans won in 1945 and won in 1991. That empire is now ending. And one way of thinking about it, are you a physics guy, Archie?
Not at all, no.
Okay, fine. So in physics, there's something called a force diagram where, for example, take a helicopter. It's got like thrust upward, but it's also got gravity downward, and it's got the rotors this way and so on, right? So you add up all the forces on something, and then you can tell where it's going to go, and something that's not obvious. And if you think about the current U.S. government, there's 4 forces on it. Red America they oppose the deep state. Blue America opposes the Trump administration. Tech America opposes the regulatory state, and China opposes U.S. hegemony. Okay, so all 4 forces are pointed down. It's like a solar eclipse. Hasn't happened in our lifetime, and that means the current position of the U.S. government is just headed down. Like whatever past, data you have on what it can do or what have you, everybody's basically invested in essentially diminishing its state capacity. Okay, and that's on top of a U.S. that's already socially disintegrated online, with blues and reds in their own networks. Blues are on Blue Sky and Mastodon and Threads and TikTok, and reds are on Gab and X and Truth Social, right? And so that means basically, if you think about it, things happen on the internet first, and then they get printed out in the physical world. Like you do a Google Doc, then if it's really important, you print it out. Or you have an Amazon shopping cart, and then you print it out, it's delivered to your door. Or you have an Uber, and you're finding a car, and then you print it out, and it pulls up to the curb, right? And in the same way, this digital secession, this digital separation that's already happened between blue and red America will get printed out in the physical world, and that'll manifest as probably something like India's partition, which is not a civil war, but it was essentially 2 groups that just didn't get along and had a huge mass migration. And that's already happening with blues going to blue states and reds going to red states, right? And so after the tariffs, 190 countries are seeking alternatives to American empire. And one of the reasons is it's ending as a hub for global business. Again, if you add it up across ideologies, shooting CEOs, bombing Teslas, proposing in seriousness unrealized cap gains taxes. I mean, this was a real proposal from the Democrat faction, right? Which is crazy stuff. It's basically seizure of wealth. It's a wealth tax. Abolishing police, blocking tourist, student, and worker visas. It's worse than a wealth tax even. It's insane stuff. Abolishing police, blocking tourist, student, and worker visas, slashing research funding, corrupting Delaware, imposing unprecedented tariffs. When you add it up and you just look at it like you're a Turkish businessman, right? You're a Japanese businessman. Is this a place that you want to invest for the next 10 years? If you're a student, if you're a tech worker, do you really want to try and get residency in this country? I don't think so. America is not a stable place to do business anymore, and global GDP has actually already moved to Asia. Okay, this graph over here shows that for thousands of years, the geocenter of the global economy was in Eurasia, and that's why Marco Polo, went to China and Columbus sought out India. Those were actually economic centers back then. That's why the Mongols and the Arabs actually were military competitors to Europe and gave them a run for their money at various points. There's a much greater degree of sort of economic and military parity on the Eurasian continent. But then with the Industrial Revolution, everything rocketed out to Europe, and they were just way ahead technologically. And then they used this technology to beat each other up, blow each other up. And then by 1950, everything else was blown up other than the USA. So Japan was nuked, and India was socialist. Russia, Eastern Europe were communist. China was communist. Germany was blown up. Everything was blown up, right? Other than the US and Western Europe. And that is why, basically, for decades, essentially, the world economy was centered in America. And that's a period that people think of as the normal way things are supposed to be. Like a guy who's a high school grad, can have a house and a wife and 2 kids, and they don't have to be super fancy and sophisticated. But that picture of what America was misses the fact that a guy who is much smarter or harder working in Poland or China or anywhere, that guy might have been starving to death or blown up or something. They just weren't in the game. They're under communism, right? The moment they started competing and they got into the global marketplace with the end of communism in 1991, that was the moment that things started to revert back to how the world is supposed to be. And the world economy started rocketing back towards Eurasia. And that's the Russia, India, China of BRICS, where those are actually the number 1, number 3, number 4 GDP economies in the world in order: China, then the US, then India, then Russia in terms of GDP PPP. You add up Southeast Asia, you add up where the UAE and Saudi are, the world economy actually moved back out there. So the US is ending as a hub for global business, and actually even by 2019, most GDP was actually in Asia. But given all this, I'm not saying this with any joy or anything like we're going to miss Uncle Sam when he's gone. Basically, the end of the Soviet Empire, that caused this huge identity crisis for 300 million people, a lot of shouting, a lot of shooting. And there's this great book called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More on the last Soviet generation. And if you read that, you'll see so many parts of that are very, very, very similar to what is happening in the US today. And in fact, actually, where we're at, I think 1991 is 2024 and 1992 is 2025. Should I explain that analogy?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and over Christmas break, everybody was celebrating and they were so happy that this far left ideology that had controlled their speech and so on, it had been giving, and then suddenly it was gone. And nobody even pretended to believe in any of this crazy stuff anymore. And so now the new administration was coming to power. They're like, yeah, we want to do capitalism now. That's the right thing. And so in 1992, this guy named Yegor Gaider did this thing of shock therapy, where he tried to do 70 years of, because the Soviet Union had been communist since 1917. Nobody in living memory in the Soviet Union understood how markets work, businesses work, etc. They only were told this was just evil or bad to do. They certainly didn't have any experience with it, since the last stock market in Russia had been closed, in 1916, almost 80 years before, right? And 75 years ago, right? And so what happened was total disaster. Basically, they destroyed the Russian economy. There was hyperinflation of the ruble. All kinds of terrible things happened. But the Soviet satellite states did better because they were now independent of the Soviet Union, the Eastern European satellites, the Baltics, and so on and so forth. So I think that's roughly what is happening now, right? 2024, that election was like the repudiation of wokeness, this kind of far left thing that's similar to communism. All kinds of people could speak freely. You can now say that men and women exist, for example, that kind of thing, right? And this is a huge relief, and there's a lot of celebrating by this unity party going into Christmas break. And then now, it took a little bit longer, but now with the new administration, these tariffs are similar to shock therapy. The US has not been manufacturing for 75 years, just like the USSR didn't have stock markets for 75 years, and it's been in this decline. And now it wants to do it all at once. It wants to get the whole thing back, without really just throwing people into the deep end, and it's just going to destroy all kinds of things at once, right? By contrast, the way that Deng Xiaoping reformed China was much more gradual and incremental, and that was a different kind of story. Anyway, point is, we're going to miss Uncle Sam when he's gone. The end of the American Empire will be a crisis on a much larger scale.
When you say we will miss, who do you specifically refer to? Who do you think will miss?
Good question. I would say Anglophones, meaning English-speaking people.
Yeah. So Five Eyes countries, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia.
Yes,
New Zealand.
even India, even Hong Kong, even Singapore, anybody who, I think a lot of Europe will miss it when it's gone. The reason is that it's like a wall that you're pushing against or that's supporting you. You might curse it or you might praise it in different ways, but you expect it to be there, right? And as an example, think about how many movies you've seen where the decision goes to the president's desk, right? It's like, aliens invade the earth and Independence Day, it goes to the president, right? And, Contagion, there's a deadly virus, right? And if it went not to the president of the United States of America, but to the president of Bolivia, okay, that would people are more willing to accept aliens or giant robots or things like that than the idea that the center would not be America. Does that make sense?
Sure. There's a natural, in our lifetimes, at least for a few generations, a natural gravity towards American power.
Yes, and so there's this good movie called Don't Look Up, right, which came out after the pandemic, and you can use this. It was supposed to be a metaphor for climate change, but you can think of it as a metaphor for the pandemic, or really, the economic catastrophe,
societal and institutional dysfunction in dealing with an emergency. It was a fantastic movie example of that.
Exactly, that's right. And the thing is, if you think of a hypothetical trilogy, have you seen the movie Contagion from like the early 2010s?
I may have, but I don't recall it much.
Okay, it's actually a very well done movie, and it anticipates a lot about what COVID-19 was like. A virus coming out of China, spreading rapidly, respiratory, all this kind of stuff, vaccine, blah blah. But what it gets really wrong, which is interesting, is it assumes the U.S. government is competent, and so you have these competent, dispassionate CDC people who analyze the thing. And they're there for the country and what have you, right? And that used to exist, arguably, right? Like for example, with Katrina, there's this flood in 2005, and of New Orleans, and they could send in the military. And there's this guy named Russell Honore, like Lieutenant General Honore, and he was able to restore order, right? There were hard men, behind the scenes who'd come out apolitically and just restore order, okay? And so there's an aspect of that which had a reality to it. And then, the ship of Theseus, do you know that metaphor or that concept?
No.
Yeah, so ship of Theseus, you've got a ship, and imagine you start replacing planks one by one, right? Is it still the same ship?
Sure.
Okay. So piece by piece, America got virtualized, pieces replaced, where until it became like a cardboard image, like the U.S. military is like a cardboard version of itself. It's getting defeated by the Houthis in the Red Sea. NATO is losing to Russia. And as I'll show a bunch of graphs, it's much, much smaller than China, but it still kept the sort of Hollywood cardboard image of what it was. And it really was that thing at one point, but it's just kind of ship of Theseus itself, or it has become, it's like a gradual Potemkinization. Okay, it's gradually become a Potemkin village, which is a very challenging thing to understand because it was real at one point and now it's cardboard. It's like shrinkflation in its own way, okay? And so the reason I bring that up is in 2020 with Contagion, you could see that the competent U.S. government that was assumed was no longer in evidence. And in 2022, when Don't Look Up came out, that movie showed this totally dysfunctional U.S. government that failed to save the world. But there was still something that they had in Don't Look Up. You know what that was?
What's that?
They still had the U.S. government as a place where the decision is coming to be made, even when it's making the decision badly.
And continuously making bad decisions or stalling making the correct decision.
Exactly. But at a certain point, when you screw it up enough, you lose the mandate of heaven, and the world just finds another CEO. That's what's happening. Okay.
We're seeing that. We're seeing that gradually. I think the unthinkable happened the other day with is it Japan and Korea?
Exactly.
Up an agreement with China to develop their own, I guess, financial institutions like the IMF, and also bilateral trade agreements in their own currencies, and potentially more than that as well. So
exactly.
We're seeing a shift happen already.
That's right.
We'll go into this a little bit later on, but I want you to continue with what you were doing. Yeah.
That's right. So essentially, so let me finish the talk. Let me come back.
Yeah.
Hold that point.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Great. Yeah. So, all right. So who's the successors to Uncle Sam? Who are the heirs to American empire? China inherits the physical empire, but the internet inherits American values. Okay. So let me first, though, talk about the Chinese century, right? So we need to first understand what China actually is. As a bona fide reality shill, right? People, when I say these stats I'm about to show, they'll be like, "Oh my God, you're a China shill." I'm like, I believe in objective reality, right? And I'm going to show you a bunch of numbers, right? And China is simply by far the most physically formidable state in the world, with huge growth rates in critical areas. Think of Google in its youth, America in its prime. This is like America in the 1950s. And immediately people say, "What do you mean it's youth? It's getting old. It's going to get old before it gets rich." And you can look at all these graphs, and it's basically got the same demographics as any industrialized country, except it also has tons of robots. And so it's not the end of the world if it gradually reduces its population and automates faster than that. The South, for example, during the American Civil War, lost because the North had a greater degree of automation, right? So this concept of, it's basically looking at one parameter rather than totality. Let's look at the totality, right? So Peter Zeihan has these books that basically say, yeah, the world's going to collapse, but America is going to do fine. And actually, I think it's going to be the reverse. American empire is going to collapse, and America and those that are dependent on it will be the worst off. But the rest of the world will be fine. Because if you look at, for example, these books and the picture they give you of the world versus BYD building a giant factory in China that's the size of San Francisco, whereas Elon, as amazing as he is, has to fight the government, so he can't even put up a sign in San Francisco. You're starting to see what the world is. So let me say what China is. Okay, China's number one in trade. Okay, in the year 2000, China was just trading with like some Central Asian countries, African countries. By 2024, they're the number one trade partner of just about every country in the world, with the exception being some Western European countries, Canada and Mexico. But Trump has done a great job of alienating those countries. And so the new administration is basically pushing them all into China's arms. EU is doing deals with China. Canada, of course, is looking to this as well. China's number one in steel. It was 10x, or it was less than 1/10 U.S. steel production. It's now more than 10x. Okay. China's number one in rail. It built an entire high-speed, nationwide high-speed rail network in 12 years. For comparison, the California $100 billion rail project didn't lay a single track during this period.
This is one of my favorite charts to demonstrate the progress of China, because it's not just military, it's not just industrial. This is civic infrastructure as well.
It's public goods.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. The thing is, if they had only done one or two out of the three, if they had built out the entire country, shipped all these goods around the world, and become the world's number one, creditor, right? Then you could say, like, oh, maybe they've gone into debt to do these other things, or oh, they built up their country, but they didn't ship anything out. Like you could argue that they're pulling from one to another, but they built up their country, they shipped all these goods, and they built up this enormous surplus where they hold all these treasuries, all this gold, and so on. So they just unlock the productive capacity of 1 billion people. I mean, obviously, right? But let me show you some more graphs. China's number one in electricity. In total energy production, it's just up and to the right. And this is, of course, AI and so on is going to hit a bunch of limits at a certain point, and China doesn't have those limits. It's number one in nuclear. So look at all the nuclear plants it's building. India's number two, Russia's number three. The US is not in the game. It's not making plants under construction proposed. It could get in the game maybe with special economic zones. I'm just saying it's not right now. Okay. China's number one in cars. So this is really impressive and important because they came out of nowhere after the pandemic. They flipped both Germany and Japan. Okay. And Apple couldn't pull off a car, but Xiaomi did. BYD is even outselling Teslas abroad. Okay, so these are our best guys, right?
Balaji, can I interrupt you with just a side question here? Do you think Apple pulled out of EVs because of technical hurdles that they just couldn't overcome, or they assessed the economics as being not really worthwhile in the long run?
Technical feasibility and economic feasibility do go hand in hand, right? And so sometimes you can throw money at a problem to solve it, or vice versa, right? Technology to reduce costs. So I don't know the details of why they didn't do it. All I know is that Xiaomi was copying Apple, and now it's exceeded them. That's a big deal, right? So China is no longer just a follower. It's actually now a leader, which is just an important mind shift to get one's head around, right? China's number one in ships. They have 200x shipbuilding capacity of the USA. And, Carlos Del Toro, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy in 2023, noted that one Chinese shipyard alone makes more ships than all U.S. shipyards combined. China now has the world's largest navy, right?
And I heard Lucky Palmer say the other day, and whether or not this is true, I have no idea. But it was fascinating. What's his name? Palmer Lucky or Lucky Palmer? I get them confused. But he said the reason why this is an important stat is because Chinese ships are all made to a military standard, even though they might be commercial cargo ships. They are made to military specifications. So I guess in the case of if the war did break out, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to convert them for different purposes. So that's a really important point. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, the U.S. used to do this as well with the merchant marine and so on and so forth, right? Like this whole factories in the U.S. that cranked out cars then made tanks, right? So yes, but that is they're copying a lot of things that 20th century America did, but just doing them. It's like copying Tesla, but then doing it cheaper and better in some ways. Now, again, Tesla's an amazing company. Elon always has tricks up his sleeve. But they're pretty good. China's very good, right? So anyway, you just have to. The thing is, when I say this, a lot of people just lose their minds. They're like, China's so evil. I'm like, okay, competent and evil are on two different axes. China's so evil. I'm like, if you start a fight with somebody who's really strong and evil, you'll lose, and that's actually worse than not fighting in the first place. At least understand the strength. It's something where it's funny. I think Republicans become extremely irrational on the topic of China, like Democrats do on Russia. And they just feel like an emotional kind of thing on it. And I'm not saying, by the way, that these are like good regimes. There's many criticisms one can offer, but I'm just trying to explain what China is, reality show, right? Okay, keep going. So China has the world's largest navy. That dashed line is America, and then this is, the China flipped them. And people say, oh, they don't have the aircraft carriers yet. Okay, fine. But they, as Hegseth, the defense secretary, acknowledged, they have hypersonics that can sink all U.S. aircraft carriers. And frankly, aircraft carriers, are they actually worth what they used to be? The Houthis managed to get, a U.S. aircraft carrier to be on the run and lose a plane recently in the Red Sea, right? So there may be just big sitting ducks, right? So China's number one in cities. 4 tier 1 cities, 113 cities with 1 million people. Even small cities now have a surprisingly high level of development, right? It even now has flying cars, right? iShowSpeed recently tried out eHang. Those are flying cars in the form of drone quadcopters, and they live streamed this, right? And when I showed this, a year or so ago, people said, oh my God, that's not a flying car. It doesn't have wheels, so it's not a car. It doesn't have wings. And also it can't go super long distances. And this is something where they're thinking about form rather than substance. And what really matters is do you have something that's like the form factor of a car that does what you expect a flying car to do? And this is like intra-city short hops, as opposed to flying from, Omaha to New York in a car. And so it's actually like removing constraints and thinking about the problem differently. Short hops within big cities could actually be very valuable, and people would pay a premium potentially for that. And China's also closing in on chips, planes, chips, and even AI. So COMAC, thanks to tariffs, that's pushing China and the EU together, COMAC to get European approval. China's chip makers catching up to NVIDIA and TSMC. Jensen Huang has talked about this. Half of Chinese researchers, AI researchers of Chinese ancestry, all 4 of the major chip CEOs, TSMC, AMD, Intel, NVIDIA, are of Chinese ancestry. And they're from the 60 million person Chinese diaspora. Is it really unthinkable to imagine that China could get good at chips? I think it's obvious they're going to get good at chips, especially since the tariffs mean ASML, they're no longer classifying some of the stuff they're selling to China as dual use. So that EU-China, embargo will not hold if America's attacking the EU as hard as it is.
This is a bit of an own goal that was kicked off by American sanctions on China for chips. And it probably should serve as a bit of an example, but it doesn't look like that lesson's been learned.
No, because here's the thing: if they impose those sanctions on just about any other country, right, on Iran, right, or Vietnam, it's hard to build your entire domestic chip infrastructure is hard, right? But China's capable of it, right? And so what this actually did, essentially you can only ban or sanction if you're so confident that the other guys can't figure it out. But if they can, then this actually just accelerated China's chip timelines because it reduced all those companies weren't cooperating before. And what the Biden administration and Trump admin did is they said, okay, here's a technology that exists and we know it exists and we're holding it. So it's like a known technology. There's many examples of it working, so people know it can work. There are lots of textbooks out there. And we're going to just ban just the very latest gen, and we're going to assume you can never figure it out. This is exactly you're challenging Chinese people to semiconductors, quantum mechanics, for national pride, to clone a technology that basically already exists. This is right in their wheelhouse, right? It's like challenging Italians to a pizza making contest, or to Serbians to basketball or something. This is something that it's something that's within their cultural wheelhouse to do.
And so not only have they done it and almost caught up, but now effectively the United States has created a global rival for the same market share.
Not just a peer. Exactly, not just a peer, but basically the thing is also by just playing keep away with the ball and assuming that China will never catch America, it's decades behind. There's just wrong assumptions about Chinese capabilities. The fundamental thing about the last X number of years is America underestimates China. At every step, it always does that, right? And overestimates itself, right? Blue America, actually this is almost like a recursive thing. Blue America underestimated Red America. Red America underestimates China. China underestimates, in my view, the internet, which we'll come back to. Or maybe they don't. Maybe they take it seriously. But at least 3 levels with that. So anyways, AI, DeepSeek, Manus, AI is actually competitive, right? The point is there's no high ground. You can say, oh, they can't do that yet. They're actually getting there in most things. Now, with that said, let's understand what China is not. China is not the internet. It cannot replicate the freewheeling nature of the global internet in its entirety because that's opposite to its core strengths. And in particular, China cannot do Bitcoin. And that's no small thing because the internet is one thing with economic scale comparable to China. In fact, hundreds of millions of Chinese people hold, or at least tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of Chinese people hold Bitcoin. And that's a very big deal because it means Chinese people want the VPN to get to the free internet. They want Bitcoin. They want to be able to travel abroad and not. I mean, many of them want to stay at home, but a lot of the best ones want to travel abroad. A lot of the Chinese tech founders and zillionaires have had to leave China because they weren't aligned with the party, or the party became disaligned with them. And basically, China is actually dependent on the internet for software. See, it's not dependent on America for physical goods, really. But it is dependent on, and America is much more dependent on China than vice versa. That's what people don't understand. But China is it uses GitHub. It needs the Anglophone internet to grow. That's actually a genuine peer, right? So in many ways, you can think of China as Apple and the internet as Android. China is like a vertically integrated full stack thing, and then the internet is chaotic and free, right? So now let's talk about
just
that.
On the China and Bitcoin relationship, it was relayed to me, and I think I posted it the other day in a podcast interview that I did, that China is the nation state is actually mining Bitcoin, and so. People listening to this, if you're in the Bitcoin audience, you're probably well aware that sometime, I think 2021, China banned Bitcoin
mining. A lot of mining got pushed out.
Bitcoin mining hash migrated to other parts of the world. And ever since then, we've seen an enormous increase in the hash power, the hash rate of the Bitcoin network, and such that the cost of mining a Bitcoin right now, the hash price of Bitcoin is about 125,000 US dollars, and the Bitcoin price right now is hovering around about 95,000 US dollars. So there has to be some kind of explanation for who the hell is able to mine Bitcoin at a greater cost than what the current spot price is. And
right.
The answer could only be someone who either has free energy or very, very cheap energy, or someone who has a very long time strategic time frame for doing so in the meantime.
Right. So it's possible that there's like renewables, hydropower, or something like that, where, so a lot of energy is just not, it's just thrown away. And, people are using Bitcoin mining for flaring for within the US, and to basically do demand control, right? So that power is otherwise, you can't really store energy very well. Batteries are not that good, so you want to kind of discharge it, and so you can discharge into Bitcoin mining. But I don't know. I mean, it is possible that China just mines Bitcoin. Sometimes they surprise. This is actually one of 3 or 4 real risks to Bitcoin I could go into. The first is, China could mine Bitcoin. It could rack and stack data centers, and at which point there'd have to be a fork of like Chinese Bitcoin and non-Chinese Bitcoin. But Bitcoin assumes a global peer-to-peer network. And so as such, you'd have to tag blocks that were being mined by China. And maybe China would just mine empty blocks. Or maybe they would do censorship. So if there was some mining capacity outside China, you'd be okay. Because they wouldn't be able to censor every block. They still have to abide by the protocol. And so that's what I mean, like the internet versus China. We'll have to see.
Are you talking in the instance that China dominates the mining pool?
Because they can. I mean, they can scale in the physical world really, really well, right? Yeah. So that's one scenario, right? It is also possible that you may need to have a different hash function like prog-pow. You might have to swap out the hash function. You might have to do that for quantum encryption or quantum decryption, quantum encryption. So one is Chinese mining, 2 is quantum decryption. A third possibility is that there's things they can do with the firewall. If they had all the hash power and they had the firewall, they could do like peekaboo so that the world would see wrong blocks and the blockchain would get out of sync, right? And there's various things you have to put in there. You might have to make mining quasi-permissioned where people are signing blocks or something like that. Or you might have to use other chains. It's possible. I mean, Satoshi was able to see out very, very far, but it's amazing how well his design is held up. But there's certain assumptions where maybe he couldn't see what would probably he couldn't see what would happen. So So we'll see what happens, but I do think at least right now, Bitcoin is something China can't do yet, right? Let's talk about the internet century, right? So the single most important force on the entire world, and still underestimated, is the rise of the global internet. And it's underestimated. The moment it happened, arguably, was 1991, when the so-called acceptable use policy of the National Science Foundation was repealed. And before that point, you couldn't do commerce online, and after that point, you could, right? And why is this underestimated? Because we put every transaction and communication online, but there's still key layers that operate offline. Universities, equities, currencies, presidencies, militaries, that's changing already. Universities, we're doing MOOCs, we're doing online education. There's a lot of things that are happening. Equities will have equity-backed coins or equity-backed assets. There's no reason that shouldn't happen. It's just representing an asset on chain rather than in a Google Sheet or an Excel. Obviously, cryptocurrency is changing currency. The president is just about tweeting and posting politics and social media largely. And the military is drones, right? So everything is becoming what I call internet first, right? Not America. It's like a play on words. There's America first, there's mobile first, so the political and the technological. But really, if I had to articulate it, I am internet first, right? Why internet first? You're probably internet first. The first thing you do in the morning, you're not saluting your flag. Probably you're checking your phone, because that's where your friends are. That's where your transactions are. That's your communications. That's your dashboard for your business. That's your funding. That's all this kind of stuff, right? Your job, all this stuff, right? Your information. And, Orwell had the saying, like, it takes a lot of effort to see what's like directly in front of one's face. And what's directly in front of one's face is the internet. It's this amazing thing. It's like fish can't see water, right? And people talk about pieces of the internet. They talk about AI. They talk about social media or crypto or something. But like the whole thing is the internet, right? And internet first is both a technological idea and a political one, and it's an alternative to both nationalism and socialism at scale, because it's internationalist, since the internet is international, and it's capitalist, right? But let me show examples of why it's an alternative. So the internet is mail. It took over postal delivery from state postal services. And so it delivers mail internationally for free, far more efficiently, and this is even better with messaging apps. The internet is media, right? Social media took over from legacy media, and all of these either literally or de facto state-funded entities like PBS and NPR, they were funded by the U.S. government, but like the Washington Post was funded by leaks from the U.S. government. Anytime you see a senior administration official quoted in a paper, that's a leak from the U.S. government that these guys are then reselling. Bloomberg, for example, Bloomberg News, their whole thing was being very close to the Fed when it released news of interest rates, and it would publish that first, right? So the state would create news, and then the media that was subsidized de facto by the state would report on it. Now these guys are being reduced to just being posters online, right? They are just posters on the global internet, and they can only really write about the news that network or internet personalities make.
They write about what we discuss on Twitter the next day, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's like slow Twitter, right? Basically, right? And so they're no longer in the flow of information. They've been locked out of the government because conservatives aren't talking to them. And they're also being locked out of many tech boardrooms, right? Okay. The internet is mobility, right? The internet took over taxi regulation, hotel regulation from government regulators. Ride sharing and room sharing apps are transnational cloud regulators of global marketplaces. Okay. What I mean by that is this is not just Uber's not just a taxi; it's a taxi regulator. It's got star ratings of both riders and drivers. And that took over, really, regulation. The real regulator of that system is not the medallion. It is Uber. And similarly, like a kid, nowadays lots of kids don't want a driver's license, they want a phone, because what Uber also replaces is driver's licenses, right? You don't need one anymore, right? So the internet is mobility. And by the way, it can take data if you're taking a ride in, Saudi Arabia or San Francisco or Japan.
It can
fuse. Yeah, exactly. And that data gets fused together into your rider rating in a way that those countries would never be able to cooperate on data sharing. So a cloud regulator has more scale and more quality than any land regulator, right? Okay. The internet is Mars. So NASA has passed the torch to SpaceX. And how is SpaceX funded? It's funded by Starlink, right? It's funded by the global internet. It's funded by essentially, global internet services. So the internet is actually bootstrapping into space as well, right? It's Mars. The internet is money. Bitcoin is born on the internet, best form of money yet invented. And so that's network over state. The internet is monetary policy. again, network over state, like the Fed's gyrating monetary policy, above and beyond the, or separate from, but additional to the 21 million cap, is the fact that it's so predictable, the issuance schedule, right? So this is a predictable algorithmic monetary policy as opposed to this crazy wiggling over here, which is causing business cycles and all kinds of destruction of banks and so on. And I didn't fully appreciate this until the rate hikes. The extent to which the crazy, policy shifts of rate hikes and tariffs and so on just wreaks havoc, right? The trade is contract law. So there's Ethereum, there's Solana. This is the alternative to Delaware, right? Basically, global international contracts via smart contracts, the code-based order versus rule-based order. And I know a lot of people watching this are like, oh my God, I hate Ethereum and Solana so much. Fine. If you can do it in Bitcoin smart contracts, it's also great. The internet is freedom. So all the protections of the U.S. Constitution, protections against search and seizure, those are basically vitiated by the NSA, by the TSA. But zero knowledge restores them. Tornado Cash, Zcash, encryption is giving genuinely private transactions. It's restoring freedom, restoring privacy. The internet is science, right? So this is both well underway and just getting started, but like open source, public data sets, decentralized science, reproducible research, those are the successors to centralized U.S. academia, in my view, because it's just getting hit from all sides right now. It's you have the student visa denials, and you have crazy wokeification, and you have budget cuts, and you have removing tax exempt status. It's going to be a huge mud wrestle. It's not obvious that universities remain what they are. The internet is democracy. Now, democracy, a lot of people have very different interpretations of what that is, but basically fiat democracy, American democracy, is very, very unpopular. Lots of people just don't believe it's producing good results. At first it was Republicans, now it's Democrats. Whereas I think there's something to it in the sense of the consent of the governed, right? That's the fundamental principle, is that the people should consent. And normally we think of that as, they can choose between like two parties. But what if they could choose between 1,000 polities, 1,000 communities, and they could also build their own, the 1,001st? That is, digital democracy, crypto democracy, techno democracy. I gave a whole talk of this, but basically democracy is about the denominator. It's not just about winning 51% of the vote. It's about determining over what population that vote is taken, and you can choose that population. DAO voting, on-chain voting, that shows the V1. These are large budgets that are being allocated by on-chain votes, and you can use those primitives to do other kinds of things. Okay. And finally, the internet is equality. So an immigrant might be a second-class citizen in America, and it's a really oppressive process, by the way, because one guy at one, like when you're doing a visa run or something like that, one consular official, one immigration officer, if you have 20 of them, the worst one can just ruin your day or ruin your life, but it's not letting you back in for your job, and then you get fired and you lose your visa and so on and so forth. So an immigrant...
One capricious twat having a bad day can basically ruin your life. And I've had that happen where I've had to leave the country, reapply without really knowing what my future would hold. And thankfully, it's always come through. And, I don't need to go through that anymore. But, yeah, I lived that life for a long time. And
that's right.
It's actually, when you see how petty and pedantic they can be in these positions,
yes,
it's amazing, the anxiety that you have to live with every time you approach this process. And it's essentially like if you have a 3-year visa, for the full third year, you're living with that anxiety. You really only have peace for about 2 years.
That's right.
And,
that's right. And
you go through that process is hell.
And the thing about it is, these are actually literally the hardworking immigrants that, look, people, like, if you're going to grow a society, you can grow it by reproduction or immigration or automation, right? And you're going to basically need all three, because reproduction has a time constant of decades. And if you bring in talented people, that's going to happen. That can happen within hours, right? Days. And automation, of course, you need robots and so on as well, AI, right? Those are 3 ways you can scale. And you can choose your balance. You might say, okay, I'll set this to 0 and I'll just do, reproduction automation. Fine, okay. But certainly if you're starting a company, you're not going to be able to reproduce your way into growth. You're going to need to recruit people, right? And your immigration policy is a lot like your hiring policy. And what I find that's interesting is people are either, like the West is, and especially America, has lost all ability to have any kind of subtlety or nuance, it's either 0 or it's 1. It's either let everybody in, including like terrorists and drug dealers, or let nobody in, including strip searching German tourists or whatever, right? It's like call everything in crypto a scam, including Bitcoin, or nothing is regulated whatsoever, and there's just zero probity, right? Whatsoever, right? And that just basically, the reason is that making fine judgments is hard, right? To make a judgment call, you need to have judgment, you need to have data. It's like a binary classifier. You don't want to have everything negative, that's a false negative. You don't want to have everything positive, that's a false positive. But in machine learning, it's actually hard to have high sensitivity and high specificity. And it's very easy to set everything to 0, everything to 1, right? So anyway, point is though, the internet is equality. Immigrants may be second-class citizens in America, but they're first-class citizens of the global internet, right? That's what a peer-to-peer network means. We're all peers on the global internet. All nodes are equal, with equal opt-in access to fair monetary policy, contract law, property rights, identity. And that's actually how, this is really the version 3.0, right? That means there's hope, that the internet is the heir to American values. It is the libertarian values of freedom and money and contracts and capitalism, but it's actually also the progressive values of science, media, equality, democracy, which of course have been, these words have been abused in recent years. But that actually means that I think it's easier to turn around these words than to turn and the concepts behind them than turn around the USA as an entity itself, right? So it's both the libertarian and the progressive values. And then at this point, people say, "Oh my God, Balaji, the internet isn't a place," and they'll visualize you as a guy like this who's just like in his own VR world, right, making everything up, right? The internet isn't a place, right? You don't understand hard power in the real world, tech bro. This is what a lot of people will say. And my answers to that are twofold. First is I do understand hard power. Unfortunately, China has it, America doesn't, and so the entire model of the world that is based on like American hard power is just obsolete at this point. It's getting mark to market. But number two is, the internet may not be a place, but there are many internet places and many more yet to come. What I mean by that is, when I say the internet isn't a place, but there are internet places. So for example, Christianity isn't a place, but there are Christian places. There are churches, cathedrals, even many countries with the cross on the flag, right? And Islam isn't a place, but there are Islamic places. There's mosques, there's the Kaaba, and of course there's many countries with the crest on the flag, right? And similarly, the internet isn't a place, but there are internet places. Like these giant data centers, these tech conferences, and of course El Salvador, the Bitcoin country, those only exist in their current form because of the internet. These data centers and tech conferences wouldn't exist at all without the internet, right? So there are internet places, including startup societies and network states. And in fact, there's dashboards of these now, and new ones are popping up all over, and there are a lot of them. Okay, this is, I think, what comes next after cryptocurrency is crypto community. And this is how we move towards what I call the network states of the internet, a loose organization of startup societies. And that's also how the United States of America arose, basically. It was a loose organization of startup societies that were started on the frontier at that time, which was America. And they were all just independent colonies on their own. And if you think about this is like CoinMarketCap, where these are the valuations of the different coins, and this is the sum of all the coins. And then over time, they all individually increase in value, and their sum added up to the total population of what eventually became the United States of America. And then more societies started up, and more populations rose, and then over time, it became the thing that we recognize in its current form. Okay, so this is like the bar chart view on the USA, right? And so they did compete with each other because people would migrate from Pennsylvania to New York or vice versa. There were 50 states eventually all competing with each other, but they also cooperated. It's competition and cooperation, right? And that's how I think these communities can be. And that's a version 3.0, right? Just like you had the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, just like you had the United States of America, I think what comes next is the network states of the internet. And just like America took the torch from Britain, the internet takes the torch from America. That's how we defend freedom and equality. And that's what I'm building. The version 0.1 of this, as crazy as it sounds, by the way, it's like there's only one thing more ambitious than the next US dollar, and that's the next United States of America, right? And I think we have to rebuild that. To be clear, I'd be happy if this stuck around forever. If it was as it was in the 1990s and the 2000s, that was a really great moment in time, certainly for Americans and for people who are sympathetic to that. But but that's not what it's going to be. Just it's going away. So we're not killing grandpa. We don't want grandpa to die, but we do need to prepare for what comes afterwards, and we need to raise something in the place, right? And I think we can reflect those values with the network states of the internet. So what's next? Well, I wrote this is all theory. What's the practice? Come on, deliver. Okay, fine. So I wrote a book on startup societies and opened a startup society myself, and that's Network School, and that's the opening day. And we have a fellowship for people from around the world to come and found companies, but of course you can just apply as a member. If you're interested in new societies, come to Network School, come to ns.com. So, okay, there we go. That's my presentation, but that gives, I think, a coherent worldview. Let me pause there, get your thoughts. That was a lot.
Yeah, it certainly does. And, I followed you for a while on X, and you're a guy with a lot of ideas. Probably the guy with the most ideas. You and Brian Romelli. Do you know Brian? He's on
X. I know him. I know him a little bit from X. Go ahead.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I think you two are competing for the title of most ideas. So why have you committed to this idea amongst all the ideas that you've had?
It's a great question. I mean, the thing is, there's lots of things in tech that have sort of been romantic goals that we've wanted, right? For example, virtual reality, something people had wanted for a very long time. And then Palmer Luckey locked in and delivered Oculus, right? And, AI was something people wanted for a long time. So much writing on this. And then, Altman and OpenAI just took it longer and just took it more seriously than anybody else. They really believed in AGI, they did it, right? And it was ideological as well as economic, right? And obviously cryptocurrency, there were ancestors of this, Xiaomi and eCash, all this kind of stuff. We know the history. And then Satoshi came and system integrated it all into the first working thing, Bitcoin. And this thing was kind of flat, and then it just took off like this, the right time and place for it, right? And I think if Bitcoin grew out of the financial crisis, network states will grow out of the political crisis. Like basically all of the things that have been constants in 2008 were suddenly variables, like is the dollar, like the money printing, these things that we had taken for granted, layers of the system that had previously not been messed with suddenly were becoming visible, right? And that's what's happening now where, for example, all the questions on identity relate to this as well. Like, for example, who is an American? Without reference to their actual physical, literal passport, there's like 10 different definitions. Like only the people who came here on the Mayflower, or like only the people before Ellis Island, or like only people before 1965. People have these concentric circles definitions, and they feel very strongly about this, and they yell at each other on X. And you can actually see how people can get to the open borders definition from that, because drawing the line is actually hard to do, right? And fundamentally, though, the reason you have to draw a line in some ways is if you don't have an identity, if you can't define who's in or out of a community, then you can't secure territory, because if the border control is asking for who's in, who's out, and without identity, there's no territory. Okay. The problem is there is no such thing as an American anymore. There's no such thing as a Korean, for example. There's only North Korean and South Korean, right? So there's no such thing as American. There's only Blue American and Red American, and actually lots of sub-tribes within them that don't get along, right? And the only thing that keeps them together right now is the dollar, and that's going. That's like lost double-digit percentages against.
There is a third tribe that we're kind of leaving out of this discussion.
The tech guys.
They're the independent, non-committed as well, and they're like than either of the blue or red. How do they play into your thoughts?
So on one level, people say, oh, tech is very, very small. It's just like whatever, hundreds of thousands or millions of people. On another level, it's actually very large because WhatsApp has 3 billion people and X has hundreds of millions and so on. So if you look at it as the blue American leadership class, the red American leadership class, and the tech American leadership class, Tech America actually does lead more people globally, right? And tech is not just America, it's actually internetisms, it's internet first. The internet is as America is British. That's a good analogy because obviously America owes so much to Britain and it was born out of Britain and so on, but then it became something bigger, right? It became something of its own. It was more internationalist, it was more capitalist, it had more people, it had more scale, it's a more ambitious version, right? And that's what the internet is. The internet is the version 3.0, the next version of America. And that doesn't mean, America wasn't anti-British. It was just post-British. It was moving on its own axis, right? And the internet is not at all anti-American, but it is certainly larger than America. And one way of looking at that, you can answer that question, by the way, two different ways. Is the internet American? If you say it is American, then you get into making drones and so on for the US military, which is fine. And I know people are doing that. Okay, fine. But if you say the internet is not American, or it's not only American, well, that's also obviously true, because there's the Spanish internet, the Portuguese internet, the Hindi internet, and so on and so forth. There's all these internets of other countries and linguistic spheres. Most of the users of the internet are not American. As I showed, more and more of the unicorns are not American. Certainly many of the employees at the major tech companies, 50% are non-American. Much of their revenue is non-American, right? So they're really internet first. They're American in origin, but internet in result. Just like America itself was British in origin, but American in result, right? So that third tribe that you mentioned, the problem is they don't have the numbers within the US, right? So they're going to have to, in my view, exit. Either that or get sovereignty, like make Starbase Texas, that kind of thing, into the special Elon zone, So they'll actually have to acquire territory, which you might be able to do with the hard currency of Bitcoin. It's going to be really wild. A lot of crazy things are going to happen, I think. I mean, if you want adventure, North America will be a very adventurous place, sort of like Russia was after the collapse, like the USSR was after the collapse, right? But many people in the rest of the world will just want stability very reasonably. And anyway, let me pause there. Go ahead. Ask me some more questions. We can wrap soon.
I want to take it back to Trump and the tariffs. And what do you think his end game is? Because I think that plays into the broader landscape of great power conflict. And within that context, I also want to introduce the topic of India and what kind of a role that will play in,
Yeah.
it's a huge, I regard it as really a huge player in global politics that's often overlooked, both for its power right now and its potential in the next 20 or 30 years as well. So, yeah, I'll throw that out.
Very good question. So, okay, let's take the first one first. So I'll try to be more concise. So
No, please, be as elaborate as you like. I like this a lot, yeah.
Okay, great. So with the tariffs, basically, if wokeness was extreme selfishness disguised as altruism, I think MAGA and the tariffs are actually extreme altruism, which is in selfishness, disguised as selfishness. And the reason is MAGA thinks that the tariffs are going to make America great again and bring back manufacturing and so on and so forth. What they're actually doing is it was a push notification to every single country in the world that basically the U.S. is out of money and it can no longer, quote, afford to keep going into this trade deficit. And therefore, it's going to stop buying goods. It's putting a stop on all these orders, and everybody needs to back away and figure out their affairs amongst themselves. Stop depending on America for money, right? That's really what it's saying. And the thing about this is it's very wrong-headed in one way. In some sense, it's inevitable. In another sense, it's like saying death is inevitable and then speeding it up by 10 or 20 years or 5 years or whatever, right? So the U.S. it doesn't make stuff anymore. People know this, right? That's why they're reacting to it. But it does export dollars in tech, right? That's its business model. Its business model is, there's this article in NPR, how to spend 1.25 trillion. Have you seen this? Let me put this up on screen.
And the important thing to bring up in this discussion is that the financial instruments that the United States exports to the rest of the world, US treasuries, are much easier to replace than manufacturing infrastructure and entire industry.
Exactly. It's way easier to mint currencies than to build factories. Much easier. You're exactly 100% right. And so I don't think people get that, right? I've done both, and it's way harder. It's not easy to, like, I launched USDC, that's, a fairly big global, thing, but I've also built genome sequencing factories, and it's harder to do that, right? So here, this article, do you see this on screen, how to spend 1.25 trillion?
Yeah. No, I haven't seen that. Okay, that's a good one. What's it, 14, 15 years old?
Yeah, it's 15 years old, okay? But the reason it's so important is, so this article, how to spend 1 trillion, it's a very unusual article because it actually admits it, right? The Fed was able to spend so much money so quickly because it has unique power, can create money out of thin air whenever it decides to do so. And voila, money is created. Okay? Now, here's the thing. Do you know how many screws or widgets, bolts, whatever, you need to sell to make $1 trillion of forget even profit, revenue, right? Like, it's you would need to, like, if every widget was $1,000, you would need to sell 1 billion of them. Okay, like one to every, like just about every person in China or India, which is a huge number of people, to make $1 trillion. That's what the scale, that's what a trillion is. And they just pushed a button and created more than $1 trillion. Okay, so nothing can possibly, this is the, just from the sense of like a business model, this is the greatest business model of all time. Okay, like the scalability of being able to literally print money. And I say scalability, what I mean is normally, like as you start selling any physical object, a car, a screw, or something like that, you start to get customers that don't really want it as much. And you have to start discounting. And then you hit people that just don't want it anymore, right? You have a limited market for it. So it starts dropping off like this. Plus, it's really hard to, you've got competition, you've got, money printing destroys all of that, right? Like, you don't have to worry about whether the millionth person will want $1. Of course they'll want $1, right? At least until you destroy the currency, right? So it's like the greatest business model of all time. And the reason the U.S. had that business model, if we think about it, why does it have the ability to do this? It's because it's at the center of a global financial empire, and it had this military that maintained the high seas and that maintained the petrodollar. And it also provided, that was like the Republican part, the military part, and it also had the diplomacy part with all of these contracts signed with the world, with the WTO and with international law and training things. And the blue and the red work together to create the greatest empire of all time, with both the physical order and the rules-based order, right? Okay, so now that's just collapsing, where the U.S. military is just getting beat in the high seas, and all kinds of, the U.S. is withdrawing from all kinds of agreements and so on. And frankly, of course, Biden was doing a bunch of this stuff, with seizing the money from Russia. In many ways, you can argue the U.S. is just on the way down, and whether it's blue or red, it's tinted differently. But all of these are kind of thrashing of a declining empire kind of things, like there's a lot of things that Trump is doing that are continuous with Biden and going back to Obama kicking in doors in Switzerland for Swiss bank accounts, that kind of stuff, right? Point being, though, that this business model is the U.S.'s true business model. It's just money printing, right? It doesn't make stuff. And so it was exporting these dollars at enormous scale to the whole world. And now with these tariffs, it shut off its primary export, the most competitive export, which are dollars. Okay, so it busted its business model because it doesn't even understand what it is. Right? Go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. And I guess the way I look at this is, there are two separate parts. There's all the money printing shenanigans that have been going on for the best part of 3-4 decades now, perhaps even more, to cover up the cracks of what's happening in the economy. So I see, like, ever since the detente with China, the ruling elites have essentially sold out, the working people of America for extra margins on their businesses. I know
people say that, right? But it is true that Red America didn't get as much of a cut as they would have otherwise. But they're way better off than like a guy grinding away, in a Nike factory, right?
Sure.
And they don't appreciate how much better they just really don't. A lot of these guys have that narrative that you just said, right? And they feel the decline from the all-time high of 1950, when a high school grad could be this and that, and they think that's the natural order of things rather than their all-time peak ever, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to admit that there's other people in the world who are harder working or smarter or what have you, and that there is no right to a customer. Right? This is really what it boils down to: is can you force somebody to buy something from you, and you push that enough that's communism, right?
Well, there are a couple of pieces to that. One is, okay, it wasn't just the outsourcing of lower level manufacturing, as we've noted that China also now does very high end, high value work as well, manufacturing as well. But then there was also the undermining of the bargaining power of the average American worker. We had enormous amounts of deunionization. We had all sorts of other programs and tactics used to undermine the bargaining power of just the average American non-university educated person. Right?
Okay, but the thing is, China doesn't have unions, right? That's why they're crushing it, right? Like they don't like. Let's say I think.
I know, but the premise was that this is not a race to the bottom, that America would climb up the value-added curve, and then that would create more jobs for everybody.
I disagree with that as a premise. I think the premise was that for many years, and I think until last year, the premise was America will win any game that it's allowed to play in. That was the premise, right? And so America set up the game of global techno-capitalism. This was the system America built, right? Free markets, free trade, low tariffs, U.S. media in every country. This was the system that America built, and it put itself at the center of it as the enforcer of the order. And dollar inflation is global taxation, right? So everybody who was a member of the system, that was the business model. It maintained order on the high seas. It educated your children at Harvard or what have you. It was the final, court of dispute for all kinds of things because you had Delaware law, all kinds of things. And the way it monetized all those services was dollar inflation is global taxation. And it developed a second business model recently, which is tech. That is actually the other competitive export of America because billions of people use Google, they use WhatsApp, they use the U.S. tech services. But as I showed, the internet is decentralizing out of America, and so there's also local versions of, for example, a local version of Uber is like Grab, a local version of Google is like Yandex. Many countries are now capable of standing up local versions of American services. American services are not as world class as they were, right? In the sense of like head and shoulders above. There's been a catch up, right? And so I think I think it is true certainly that global labor markets have been integrated and that things are being, quote, moved overseas. But I think what is not being admitted is those people overseas are smart, they work hard, and they produce good products over time. And that has brought down consumer prices. I mean, like in the 90s, Americans were watching Friends while China was grinding in, factories, right? And so they are like the ant, the ant and the grasshopper, right?
I didn't know that.
Oh, it's like this fable where it's like, the grasshopper was just enjoying himself and drinking and partying. The 90s were a great party, right? And then the ant is just working away, grinding away, storing up their stuff, and so on and so forth. And then winter comes, and the grasshopper's like, and the ant has prepared. They have higher time. I always forget if low time preference.
I get that confused all the time. High, I think, means more acute, short term, and low meaning you don't really care about the now, and you have. Yeah. So delay gratification for the future. I think
a good way of putting it is the easy way to remember it is the grasshopper is short-term time preference, and the ant is long-term time preference. And all the stuff China has done over 45 years, they sacrificed for the future, which they're now having today, right? Unless you stare that in the face and you realize, you know what, they did actually. The problem is people will correctly say they stole IP, they copied, they did trademark infringement. Absolutely true. By the way, America did that to Britain. I don't know if you know about that. Like all the early stuff, like patents and stuff, Americans would, at first, they just copied stuff and it was crap. And then eventually they ascended the value chain. Very, very similar to how China did it. Okay.
Well, IP has historically been the domain of the strong, not of the rising or the weak, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's defending the castle. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. Even Hollywood was started because those guys went all the way west to California, and Edison's patents were harder to enforce 3,000 miles away. So they basically did Hollywood. They started to get revenue, then they could fight it in the courts, and eventually got to a settlement, right?
Same with YouTube under the umbrella of Google.
Exactly. So that's right. But actually what happened was YouTube beat Google Video because Google Video had to be very safe and not allow uploads, and YouTube could be outside, and YouTube grew really fast. Yeah. And then they managed to land the car perfectly and then flip into YouTube, and then there's a 10-year lawsuit with Viacom, and then Google's budget could win that lawsuit. Right?
Interesting. I didn't remember that Google had a video service. So there you go. Okay.
Yes, they did, and it was basically something which it was similar to what they did with AI, right? With AI, they were very conservative until ChatGPT came out and just showed that they couldn't do it, right? Anyway, so the reason I want to slightly contest what you're saying is a lot of red Americans have that exact woe is me narrative. Oh, I've been done so hard. Oh my God, it's so terrible, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, it is true that they have gotten less of a cut of empire than they used to. But what they're asking for is so confused. They basically want the demographics of 1945 with 45% tariffs, right? Like, that's really what they want. Right?
What do you mean by the demographics? You mean
I mean, to be very honest, they want, and I understand why they want it, but they want like a white Christian, homogenous America. That's what they want. A lot of the right wingers will basically say that, and like look, this is a whole complicated topic, but that's really what it is that they desire underneath it, and they're using economic policy as a proxy for that when the world has just radically changed, right? So it's like looking for the quarters under the lamppost kind of thing, right? Okay, well, I can change the tariff rate back to what it was in the very distant past. Maybe I can change the demographics to that. Maybe I can but that's just not how things work. Like changing one parameter, it's like saying, you're in a plane and you're like, look, when we're ascending, I can floor the accelerator, nothing happened. So when I'm descending, I can floor the accelerator, nothing will happen. But of course, acceleration is not the only parameter. It's also, acceleration is a vector. Like what is a vector you're heading on, right? So they're doing this single parameter comparison, like we had high tariffs in the past and we were rich, and so. But there's 500 different parameters that have changed. It's now a multi-ethnic, polarized country that has already moved its manufacturing overseas, a lot of it, right? And really the barrier, if they were serious about it, by the way, I'm not just like a critic. I publish all kinds of stuff. I mean, they don't have to listen to me, of course, but just in terms of what they could have done. A, deregulation, right? Meaning not reduce all the laws, but focus on specific things that are holding things back. All kinds of building laws, for example, make things extremely onerous to build. B, special economic zones or special Elon zones, like Elon, Palmer Luckey, et cetera, can all get their own zones where they put a line through select laws. Like they're still keeping most of the laws on the books, right? Meaning you don't need to come up with a new law for assault or disorderly in public. Lots of thought has gone into those statutes. You can just import them over, right? But you maybe put a line through the SEC jurisdiction or whether FDA can prevent a terminal patient from taking a drug, right? That kind of stuff. You make very surgical edits and you get zones that have a totally different character because of that surgical edit, right? Or a third thing I mentioned is you could reverse engineer supply chains in the following way. If you just ask these businesses to report who their vendors were, you could form a network that showed whose vendor's vendor was whom, and then you could find the strategic areas rather than focusing on like Canadian maple syrup or French wine, like Chinese semiconductors or something like that. Fine, that's a very targeted thing. You start to do what's called import replacement order, right? So many things they could have done if they were smart, but they're not. They're just like, it's actually crazy what's happened. How did smart people do something like this? And I think part of it is there's a lot of low IQ people who are applauding everything on Truth Social. And so the feedback signal is like idiocracy. Go ahead.
No, you just made me laugh. That's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like idiocracy, just it's literally like, President Camacho, blam, 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 blam in the air. And, there's misspellings and crazy capitalizations. And you realize it's like a persona. It's not like a joke anymore. This is it, right? And so obviously, one way I put it is these are people, and I include Biden, Trump, all these people, the entire thing, like they've inherited something they couldn't build, right? In the sense that this is something which was made by, the people who understood balance, right? Maybe the last good American president was George H.W. Bush in 1991, right? Or like it was termed in 1992. And he was one who saw the end of the USSR all the way through. He saw, that there wasn't like, loose nukes. He saw that, these countries were basically propped up and like Eastern Europe was rebuilt after communism. That was like maybe the last good American president, really great American president. I think history should look more favorably on him because there wasn't a nuclear war in the post-Soviet Union. He stabilized the whole thing. That's a very, very big deal, actually. And then since then, because the U.S. became a hyperpower, it just wasted its money printing ability, right? Like if you just had, it's not the rest of the world. Put it like this: if the red American has a beef, their beef is with the blue American who didn't give them enough of a cut. It's not with Vietnam, right? Vietnam.
That's what I was going to ask you next. Is do you think the government has, at a policy level, an obligation to ensure some level of I don't want to use the word distribution, but or another woke word, equity, but
Actually, I do. I do. Well,
Certain parts of the country are not left out in the interests of social stability and cohesion.
yes, I do. I do believe that. But I also think that the way it's like equity in a company, right? The way you do the split, the numbers really, really matter, right? It's very easy to go overboard on redistribution such that you're taking away the incentive for merit, the incentive for hard work.
And once you start, kind of like the empathy thing, empathy we can all agree is a virtue. But once you start, where do you draw the line? And I guess we've seen that play out over the last 5 or 10 years as well. Please,
Exactly.
I interrupted you. I want to hear the rest of your thoughts.
No, you're absolutely like basically. I think for example, what happens is you have a working system, and then entropy happens, and it just becomes a non-working system, and then you have to build a new one, right? So there's lots of things which, if you're doing it from that's the whole concept of startup societies, network states is you have ideas on politics. Well, okay, make them reality by having, as it's called, a one commandment community, right? So you cannot change everything in the world at once. Just like a startup has to focus on like one product, you have like one thing that you're doing that's different. So network school is startup societies are good. That's our like one commandment, right? And then everything follows from that. Startup societies are good, so we're going to build one as a template. We're going to help other people bootstrap theirs, and so on and so forth, right? Another society might be veganism is good. Another might be carnivory is good, right? So you can innovate that way. But coming back to your point about distribution, I think Singapore does it well. I think the UAE does it well. I think there are countries that do this well, right? Where they quote maintain social stability, but they don't take away incentives. Like they're still really capitalist, and there's still upside for people who work hard. And I also would say, frankly, I think the monetary aspect of social stability is overrated in the sense of it's almost like RGB, like there's red, green, and blue on a monitor, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. So like money is like R, but you need G and B. You need just other lenses, And like social, like for example, when people somebody compared like San Francisco and Singapore the other day. There's no social cohesion in San Francisco. You can't take a walk down the street. Like, okay, maybe very recently some people are saying you've cleaned it up. Okay, fine. But it's nowhere near as clean as Singapore is, as beautiful as it is. So some numbers like money simply do not capture social cohesion, right? Beauty, like just ability to walk down the street and see, like green trees and clean streets and people generally smiling. That's not the same as just money. Money is just one scalar. It's an individual measure. It's not a social measure. It's not public good, right? Another is purpose. Like, okay, fine, you've given them some redistribution, but what are they doing with their life, right? Okay, well, maybe you're giving them a VR helmet and they're just doing, VR all day. Okay, maybe that's actually the answer for some people, but many people want purpose, and actually they'd feel better with purpose, if they felt, they have something in the world they're working for, right? Saying idle hands are the devil's plaything. So I think, and these are complicated questions that there's no one size fits all, but I do think that having, you want to reduce envy. You want to, another big aspect is morality, whether it's religion or something else, you have to have some kind of thing where people believe that they're doing the right thing without getting paid for it necessarily, without being completely mercenary. Like a small example of this, this is an obvious point, but I had to actually realize it because it was breaking a constant of society. Remember the 2020 abolish the police thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. The insanity of abolish the police, what I realized was it was among other things, it was abolish the prestige of the police, right? And the thing is that, like being a policeman, like being, someone in the military, if you're a policeman and, I don't know, let's say there's 100 policemen for a town or something, right? They are guarding property that's much more valuable than all of their wages put together. Okay. And so they have to be, quote, in a sense, rewarded with something much more than money, because otherwise they'll become corrupt mercenaries, like what happened in the former Soviet Union and so on, where they're like, oh, you know what? You only have that building if I let you have that building, nice thing, right? So if you take away the prestige, if you take away the fact that society approves of what they're doing, if you call them all kinds of names in the book and, you say they're bad guys, well, only bad guys will then join the police, right? The police are bad, and good guys who just don't want to take this level of abuse, they want to stand for something higher, they'll leave and do something else, okay? And so you're left with corrupt bureaucrats, time savers. So this is very bad because basically security is the ultimate public good. That is to say, there's really no such thing as private security.
It's the first public good, really. I mean, I've had friends of mine, women, go to Dubai, for example. Not a place that you would expect Western women to be all that fond of because of certain preconceptions. Come back raving about it because they just felt completely at ease, safe, and everything was modern, clean, easy to navigate, easy to get around, and they just felt so much more comfortable and relaxed. Just a simple exactly. feeling of not being harassed or not being bothered in any way.
Exactly.
Which took me by surprise, actually.
Well, that's right. There's 250,000 Brits that have moved to Dubai, something like that, right? So, yeah, I think, it's a big number. I mean, 250,000 is a lot, right? That's not a small, that's something where it's funny, among the young people, Dubai is seen as a level up, right? From the UK. It's like, oh, you got a great job, you're going to Dubai, right? So that's new. That's like, a really, new thing. And that's the ultimate proof that it's good because people are relocating, across the world there, right? And so there is like in the UK or in other countries, there's less of a denial that this is happening. But in America, because they have this conception of themselves as global number one and whatnot, which they were, they're in the, denial stage. It's like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, the 5 stages of grief, right? And that's a Kubler-Ross cycle. And actually, Quillette had this article on this. And they're in the denial/anger phase right now, right? But anyway, so to your point, though, the people who were responsible for making sure that there was, when you have the money printer, right? You have this insane thing. You could have invested in that in Mars and had all these guys being mechanics on the Mars project, and you outsource the sneakers overseas and you work on the highest tech stuff, right? You could have had regulatory zones. There's all kinds of stuff you could have done with wise leadership, But basically what happened was it was so easy to get money printing that all kinds of people decided to party or just have fun. And now they're the grasshoppers, and then other civilizations are the ant. That's really what's happened. That doesn't say those civilizations are good. It's just they saved and scrimped and so on over a long time.
Balaji, I've thought for some time that every problem the United States has with China, the answer lies with India.
Interesting. So let's talk about India.
Well, I'd like to devote the rest of the time that we've got together on India, because I don't feel like, first of all, enough people really talk about the enormous power and potential of India, and not many people know enough to talk about it either.
Sure. So I can show a bunch of graphs that are like all the graphs we just showed on China, similar graphs on India, where India is like, but with one very important caveat. I think on all these graphs, China is like far and away number one, and India is like a distant number two, but it's a real number two where it is actually improving on many dimensions: electricity, infrastructure, nuclear plants, all kinds of stuff India is improving on. And it's really visible when you're there on the ground. It's a huge difference from my youth. If you had told me that I prefer living in India to America in the 80s or the 90s or even the 2000s, I would have just been shocked. But that's I have a place there, and I actually spend a lot of time there because I'm recruiting a lot of engineers and so on. And people are hungry coming out of there. And with that said, I'm moderately bullish on India, extremely bullish on Indians. Okay, so one of the things that's paradoxical about countries is the very poor and the very rich countries actually don't send too many people abroad usually because these guys can't afford it and these guys don't want to go anywhere, right? But as they get into that middle income, they send a lot more people abroad because now they can afford a plane flight, their horizons have expanded, and they can, the country is growing, but they might be able to grow even faster still if they go abroad, right? And so that's where India is right now. And it is throwing off this enormous diaspora of all these people. And some are talented and some are not, or whatever. Some countries like, Canada didn't have selective immigration or what have you. But that's not really the fault of, I don't know. I wouldn't choose that the fault of India or Indians, but that's a whole separate thing. If you don't, it's like you have to have a talent filter when you're recruiting, right? Point is, though, that what is India's role in all this? I think India is a major component of, when I say like China versus internet, like India is kind of in between where it's obviously a country. So it's like a land power, like what China is. But it will probably be the plurality of people on the Anglophone internet. right? Not the majority, maybe, but the plurality, like maybe the single largest group, right? Because it's about to flip, if it's not already flipped, the US for the number of English speakers online, right? And what that means is, I think you have, like a version 3.0 in a different way. So you went from Anglos to and Christendom to, that was like Europe, right? To the West and America and the Judeo-Christian world. That's like, version 2. And now I think we go to the internet and then Indians as a co-equal, right? And that's the Indo-European world. So Indians, Europeans, Canadians, Australians, Americans are all equal on the internet, and they all have a similar kind of disposition on the English-speaking internet, right? And right now we have almost like tectonic plates. It's like a collision with modernity where 1 billion Indians are online at the same time. So they all don't have the H-1B visa, but they have TCP/IP visa. And so all kinds of crazy collisions that are happening. But at the same time, lots of Indians are acculturating to what the world is, outside of India. And so that will be a very important force on the English internet. And, how much, GDP could that generate? Well, there's about 3 million Americans that generate about 50% of US tax revenue. It's very, very lopsided like this, right? And 30 million Americans is about 70%. So, and Indian Americans, there's about 7 million Indian Americans, and they have very high income education levels or what have you. And so the question is, how many more in India are at that level? I'm not saying it's all 1.4 billion by any means, right? But even if it's like 5%, right? It's 5%, that's 70 million people out of 1.4 billion. 70 million people would mean you might be able to do something on the order of, like if it's 10x the Indian American, thing, that's like 60%, 70% of US GDP. That's fairly formidable. That's a real thing, right? Or US tax revenue, right? And if it could be more than that, it could be less. But I think ballpark, there is something there where that will be a real power in the world, right? But different than China. It's almost the mirror opposite. Like China plays the world's best home game, India plays the world's best away game, right? China is the land, and the internet is the cloud, and India is somewhere in between, right? So, for example, India is a member. India, in many ways, is the global swing vote because it is democratic, but it's also part of BRICS. It's got lots of people abroad, but it's also very nationalist in its own way, and so on and so forth, right? So I think of India as the intermediate. That's how I think of India.
So if we take, a lot of people relate China and India to one another because of the sheer scale and obvious proximity as well. And if we take a look at China's sort of accelerated rise through the early to mid 2000s and sort of run our eyes over the parallel path that India went through over that same time period to the current moment, how do you compare the two? I mean, while China was building industries and infrastructure, why wasn't the same thing happening in India at the same time? Was there a different relationship with respect to foreign direct investment? And what is changing now to enable all of that?
So, well, first, there's several things. So first is China started liberalizing in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. And India only started in 1991. So that's one big thing where on many axes, India is 10 years behind China. But they're also just very, very different places. Like China has always kind of been like one entity, whereas India has been like Europe, where, Tamils and Telugus are as different from Gujaratis as, Spaniards are from Finns, right? Like Europe, there is a linguistic, cultural whole, like, Christianity is something that's recognized, but there's a very big difference between Spaniards and Finns and what have you, like very different culturally and what have you, right? But they're all part of the EU, right? Mm-hmm. And, the concept of a unified India was really something that only arose in modern times as a consequence of colonialism, which basically led to the formation of a pan-Indian identity. In fact, it's called the Indian Union Territory, like the United States of America, like the Indian Union is what like the formal name is, because the union of all of these so-called princely states, right? So, but that's real now. Like you have actually a real Indian identity, and people think of themselves as Indian, and it probably because people look pretty similar across the whole thing. Like there are Spaniards who could blend in with as Finns and vice versa, right? some bronze painters. You know what I'm talking about. There's a gradation, a clinal gradation, right? So that's sort of gotten memed into reality, right? So India's become more unified than it's ever been in its history, and but it's never been as unified as China is, right? Like India's always had, So let me make a bunch of kind of high level distinctions. So China and more generally East Asia, when it's culturally charismatic, it's visual. Okay, so for example, Japan is anime and video games. Korea is K-pop. Hong Kong was Hong Kong cinema. And when China is charismatic around the world, it's like TikTok. It's like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It's the visuals of their cities and so on and so forth. Because their language is very eloquent within Chinese, but it just doesn't translate well, to other tongues because it doesn't have prepositions and so on and so forth. And so it's like very elegant and concise within Chinese, but just something is lost in the translation, right? And vice versa. Okay, so China is visually impressive. They've got sleek lines and so on and so forth. India is verbal, right? So India has, for example, Buddhism is an operating system that China forked and made its own, but it came out of India. Just like communism came out of Europe, they forked that operating system, made its own. The internet, they forked it and made its own. That's a very Chinese thing to do. They take something out there, they fork it, they modify it, they make it with Chinese characteristics, right? Indians, they never went full communist because they had a cadre of people who would argue for what we might call libertarian values or what have you. They're better at arguing in English, right? So they never went as far left and they never went as far right? So they went socialist but not communist. And now they're nationalists, but they're not ultra-nationalists, if that makes any sense. They're like nationalist capitalists, more like center-right. There's so many other things I could say. I mean, like, India has many languages, and China's really centralized. Though, again, India's more centralized than it's ever been with English and Hindi, right? China's just much better at manufacturing culturally. They've got a more visuospatial culture. But they've gotten pretty good at software. China's gotten pretty good at software. I think Indians have gotten surprisingly good in the physical world in the sense of, like, the airports there are quite good. Like, the roads are it's radically improved. I'll say this, but every year when I'll travel back, I'll go to my place there like every, X number of months, right? And every time I do it, I'm like, this is improved, that is improved. It's like California, but in reverse. You know why?
What's the driving force behind those improvements?
I would say it's the internet. Like,
how so?
Well, the internet is really good for India because the internet is like Indians can trade on the internet. Indians can, IT was a source of hard currency, right? The internet meant that Indian talent could get recognized and you could be pseudonymous and you could do work online and you could work as a designer or an engineer and you'd be accepted. It brought venture capital to India. It's a lot of things. It's basically something, I think that Indians really like it culturally fits the internet and software. It's funny because in some ways, if you take Europe and you take Europeans, I think the internet is arguably something that's better for China and India than for Europeans in America. And the reason is China's running the extremely centralized version, and then Indians are the extremely decentralized version. But the intermediate version hasn't been working as well, right? And when I say the extremely decentralized, I mean like you have all these Indian CEOs and so on, globally, founders and what have you, right, putting things up.
Well, that's how I would compare and contrast the two countries, exactly as you put it, because China, my perceptions and the governance model is that the centralized government creates the framework within which capitalism operates. India is a much more disparate group of smaller countries, shall we say, or regions, and it's a lot harder to set one coherent national policy for any particular industry. I mean, have I got that right, or is that a
but there's something to it, which is India is 2 steps forward, 1 step back at times, but it is moving forward, really moving forward, and actually maybe it's like 4 steps forward, 1 step back. Like it really is. The reason I say that is, I can show visuals. Like, for example, let me show a few visuals. Just to. So this is a good one, right? You see this one, India's infrastructure. This is in 2019, right? Like, look at the airports, highways, stores, right? Like things are just radically improved from when I was there as a young man. And I visit every few years, but now I visit and I have a place like every 6 months, every year or so, like pretty frequently, right? So let me see. Here's another one. All right, this is another one, right? So you see this one on India's infrastructure is improving, right?
Yeah.
Highway network improved. Like this is, it's not as dramatic as the Chinese.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
5 years. Okay. That's in.
Yeah. These are like 3 year, 5 year, look at percentage with toilets, like boom, everything is just like this. Startups, luminosity, all these things are 5 years, 10 years, but like the improvement is real in the public goods, which is new, right? And there's a real sense of being a proud Indian and so on. Like nationalism has actually worked there, right? I'll show you a third thing. This is like in terms of, smartphones per 100 people, 5x, internet users, 2x. This is actually only over 4 years. It's 2x since then. Cashless transactions, 10x, data consumption, 100x. Like these are huge, data cost down 100x, right? Like these are really big, these are real numbers.
The improvement
right?
is real. It's tangible. You can see it in the metrics across sort of various digital and infrastructure metrics.
Here's another one. Can you see this video?
Yeah, I can see it. It's the airport, right?
And I just took this video because I was like, this is a world-class airport. Mm-hmm. It's clean. It's beautiful. Like you would not know this was like an Indian airport. It's P.F. Chang's. You see what I mean? Like this is what I mean, but the internet is what comes after America. All these American brands are there, but they're all run, operated, the customers, everybody's Indian, right?
Yeah.
So that is something where I don't know how far it gets, but it's got a lot of runway ahead of it. Like I'm very as I said, moderately bullish on India, extremely bullish on Indians. Now, you might say, okay, what industries will India be good at? So I think it's the complement to the Chinese industries. So crypto, right? Like the finance, right? Because everything where Indians are equal, because on the global internet, they're equals, right? So crypto, they're an equal. They don't need to be able to immigrate to New York to be able to trade. They can just trade on a decentralized platform that treats them exactly equally, and they can diligence a contract like everybody else. Social media, they can post, and they can build followings, and they don't have to have the connections to Hollywood or mainstream media or anything like that, right? AI, they can create content exactly similarly. You can be a storyteller, this, that, the other, and you can do it under a pseudonym, and there's no barriers anymore. Barriers gone, right? Other things which are interesting, like space, like ISRO, they've actually done really well with this, with low cost, like landing on the dark side of the moon and so on. It's got an equatorial location, so it can do well there. Medicine. So there's obviously a lot of Indian doctors, a lot of Indian research scientists and whatnot, and obviously a lot of Indian engineers. So I think medical tourism, India can become the doctor of the world in many ways. Medical tourism, telemedicine, stem cell treatments and stuff like that. There's a lot that can be done in terms of medicine and biotech, which I think Indians are well positioned on. They have, they have a need for it themselves, or we have a need for it because, like South Asians are not great at the Olympics. They don't have high levels of fast twitch muscle fiber. They have high insulin sensitivity. They have belly fat, all this kind of stuff, right? So getting really good at biotech is going to be an important thing for Indian health, right? So it's like finance, media, medicine, probably law, right? Smart contracts and so on become basically internet first law. And I think India is actually getting good enough at manufacturing. Like 20% of iPhones, up from 1% a few years ago, are made in India now, which is a lot. That's genuinely more than I expected. India's it's not going to out-manufacture China.
But do you see more of that, more of the manufacturing pie from US-based companies migrating from China to India?
Yes. Like the iPhone thing has made me more of a believer on this. Going from 1% to 20%, that's real, right? That's like millions of units. That's, even if we'll see what happens with quality or what have you, right? But it's just hard to do that. It's just hard, And that means because you need roads, you need, these phones need to be shipped on time. they have to be, there's 1,000 dependencies that you take for granted, that you have a functional road, that you have a port, that you have a train that leaves on time, that you have packages, that you have police that will guard it, that are not corrupt, blah, 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 blah. 50 different things have to happen for you to have something that can actually ship things to the rest of the world, right? India has that now. And in a sense, I keep my expectations low so it can surprise to the upside, right? But I do think that, especially with robotics, as robotics comes online, right, India will be a big buyer of robots. Indians will. The reason is robotics, when it works, it turns the whole thing into software. You should just give the commands and write it down, and it'll do it, right? That's like, the gap between the word and the deed just keeps narrowing. And Indians are really good at words, or at least the good ones are, right? So that means that as everything becomes an API, like lots of things, like you can move, we're in what I call the age of the phrase, which is itself a phrase, right? The age of the phrase is, 140 characters on social media, or 12 words for your Bitcoin, or a prompt for your AI, right? A few words of power, well-chosen words of power, can do a lot.
Yeah,
right?
I'm discovering that with Replit. I'm using that at the moment to build a couple of tools. Incredible.
Exactly. And so that thing of just reading and writing all day is something that just really taps into something deep there, right? It's sort of like, the another thing is Indians are spiritual but polytheistic, right? And I think that's also something that, this is much less tangible. I think this will be something difficult for China to compete with in the following sense, which is what I call the moral innovations, right? For example, vegan village and carnivory. Those are moral innovations where they're saying some aspect of society is bad and this is what's good. And the vegans are saying, oh, factory farms and so that's terrible. We need to be vegan. All, healthy, vegetables, delicious, but it's all vegetables, right? It's morally the right thing to do. And the carnivores are like, look at all this crap from McDonald's, it's terrible. Just meat alone, that's the highest nutrition thing. We were built to be omnivores, the spear, eat like a caveman, you'll add muscle and so on and so forth. Now, the thing is, in my view, I think both the vegan and the carnivore are improvements over the McDonald's diet. Those people who are them are probably thinner, healthier, yet, of course, they're mutually incompatible moral innovations, if that makes any sense, right? Moreover, the reason they're a moral innovation is first you have to say veganism good, and then the tech stack to follow it happens afterwards. You set the goal, and then you're like, okay, here's how I make cauliflower this and broccoli that, here's how I grow that faster, whatever, right? So you set the direction, and the technology follows, right? Or with carnivory, you set the direction, and then you've got, okay, how do I do beef jerky, this, that, and the other? How do I have these different kinds of snacks there, right? And so the moral innovation actually precedes the technological innovation. Similar to like Bitcoin was something where the moral innovation really came first. Decentralization good, inflation bad. And the reason I'm saying in that sort of primitive way of X good and Y bad is that actually encompasses what a moral thing is. You can expand it, but once you say X good, Y bad, or something I'm indifferent to, right? Also, by the way, going from good to indifferent is itself a change, right? Like, to be ultranationalist, okay, or versus to be, for example, a consumer, a citizen of the world where you're just going to the best government. You're going from ultra good to indifferent, right? And indifferent doesn't mean negative, but it means indifferent, or at least you're going to the government that treats you best, right? And your community's really on the internet. Point being, these kinds of moral innovations, like vegan village, the carnivore community, the Sanskrit society, the Latin village, and so on and so forth, right? Latin immersion. You can come up with hundreds of these kinds of concepts for a society. And China won't be able to copy that because each of those will be the kind of thing. And when I say Indian, of course, lots of people will be good at this or whatever. But since you asked, like this kind of concept of building a philosophical structure and then having a technological vision that maps that, that's something that I think the reason China can't copy that is if it brought those 1,000 societies and their incompatible moral innovations into China, it would fragment China. Right? It can't do that, right? So, but you actually have you'll have a lot of cool stuff here. There'll be lots of places that people will want to visit, right? So it doesn't, by the way, have to be adversarial. Maybe you just have lots of Chinese tourists that go to all of these 1,000 things. Maybe like you have 100,000 Chinese people that try each of these 1,000 societies. And so you have 100 million Chinese people abroad, for example, right? There's lots of interaction there. But I think that's something that is different than the way that Chinese people tend to think about things. Like, for example, they're less into the ideological aspects of cryptocurrency and more into the financial aspects. And that's something many Chinese people will tell you is a cultural, thing there. Whereas Indians might be more ideological and less practical, though they've become more practical recently. These are broad cultural generalizations, but this is just some of my views.
Yeah. Do we have time to just finish off the last bit of this question with respect to
Go ahead.
The geopolitical aspect of United States, China, and how do you think India will position itself relative to both? Especially in light of rising trade.
India's kind of already positioned itself as the swing vote of the world, right? So it's in both the Quad and it's in BRICS, right? It's trading with the US, of course, but it's trading with Russia, right? And this is a good place for India to be. India should be the swing vote of the world, right? It is its own thing. It's its own center. It is not part of the West, nor is it fully part of the East. It is really at the intersection of both, right? And, it's in an Eastern time zone, obviously. Its neighbors are in the East. It trades a lot with the East. But in many ways, it's culturally more similar to the West. And this is, by the way, a reversal of the 20th century where it was a swing vote between East and West, but it was more aligned with the Soviets and the East and less aligned with the West. And now it's kind of the reverse, right? So I think, I think India will also be, hopefully, I believe it'll be a relatively stable society. For example, the votes were counted in just like a day earlier this year, or last year rather. And life went on. It was simply just not as polarized, not as crazy as American politics. It's more efficient, right? So India, in some sense, just on that topic, China was the second-rate version of communism for a long time, and Russia, Soviet Union was the number one. And then what happened was the Soviets just messed up their whole system in this ideological way, and China's now, it just kind of passed them and became the leading brand of communism, right? And I think
it's not really communist anymore, though, right?
I know. That's right.
I don't need to tell you that, you know that, but just for the sake of the audience and the conversation, yes. I hear people continually calling China communist, but it's kind of like, where?
It's complicated, but I think you can make the argument that it's at least partially communist in the sense of the state does have root control over everything. Right?
Sure.
So it's very capitalist, but your chair can morph into an agent from the state if they decide to exert root.
It's a one-party state, yeah, definitely.
Exactly. It's kind of like, the Matrix, how the agent morphs out of the wall or what have you, right? So that's the sense in which it's communist, right? Where there's something to it. Status at a minimum, right? It's really the Mandarin system that they've reinvented and fused it with different things. They've picked a piece of Confucianism and a piece of legalism and so on. They fused that together to their modern state, right? And so in much the same way that China became, quote, the leading brand of communism, because they still have the hammer and sickle, they still call themselves communists, they have the party, lots of pieces of organizational discipline and stuff like that. They've kept those pieces, but they've had layered capitalism, right? So in the same way, I think China became the world's leading brand of communism after the Soviets face planted. And I think after the Anglo-American world face plants, India may become the leading brand of democracy. Right? So in the physical world, there's also internet democracy, which I talked about, and those overlap, right? And the reason is Indian elections are actually conducted better than American elections. The ballots are counted in one day. There's nobody's squabbling about the outcome. It's just a more functional democracy. It's actually crazy how this works, right? And despite all the squabbling, that's the weird part. You have to kind of zoom out of that a little bit and kind of look at the results of it, right?
I have seen Indian political discourse, and it's
yes, I know. Of course, there's a stereotypical these guys in accents yelling at each other online, and so right. And it is. But you know what I compare that to? I compare that to how China made all kinds of plastic stuff for a long time, and then suddenly they're doing flying cars, and in the same way, Indians are they're becoming more sophisticated, with exposure to the world, and so the younger generation and they're all on Instagram, they're all on Twitter. They understand that's being made fun of, and so they're adapting way faster than people realize. And that's sort of a rearward-looking thing versus what it will always be. It's think of China stuck in the plastic stuff for Walmart era. It won't be that forever, right? So anyway, I think that it is good that there is a large functional democracy, and I think that's a sleeper kind of thing, right? I think what is going to happen to the U.S. or whatever afterwards, I think it's just reverting to like extreme Mad Max tribalism. Like, this is why I'm not a crypto anarchist, by the way. Like anarchy, yeah, crypto anarchy is better than that because you have order in the cloud, but disorder on the land. But really what I'm for is crypto civilization.
Balaji, thank you so much for your time. 2.5 hours feels like half an hour with you. The conversation just swept us by, and we're at the end of this fantastic interview. I really appreciate your time and being so generous with your thoughts and sharing them with us. And I hope to do this again sometime soon. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Where can people find you? Is it just Balaji S on Twitter, isn't it?
Yes, but actually just have them go to ns.com.
ns.com, the network state.com, or ns.com.
Or Network School. Network School. And just
Network.
come to our Startup Society. And if you want to follow me on x.com, Balaji S.
Excellent. We'll put that in the show notes. Thank you once again. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Great.